Mr. Mills.
My lady, may I please call the witness M3W1, who will affirm?
De pie, por favor. I do solemnly declare that I will well and faithfully interpret and true explanation make of all such matters and things as shall be required of me according to the best of my skill and understanding. Nora Orenstein, Spanish interpreter. Va a repetir después de mí lo que yo le diga.
I do solemnly,
Yo solemnemente,
Yo solemnemente,
sincerely and truly,
sinceramente y verdaderamente,
sinceramente y verdaderamente,
declare and affirm
declaro y afirmo
declaro y afirmo
that the evidence I shall give
que la evidencia que voy a dar
que la evidencia que voy a dar
shall be the truth,
será la verdad,
será la verdad,
the whole truth,
toda la verdad
toda la verdad
and nothing but the truth.
y nada más que la verdad.
y nada más que la verdad.
Please.
Toma asiento.
You are providing evidence to the inquiry this morning under the cipher M3W1. Is that right?
¿Es correcto decir que usted está prestando evidencia hoy bajo el número M3W1?
Sí.
Yes.
During the pandemic, you worked as a cleaner in a hospital.
Durante la pandemia, ¿usted trabajó como limpiadora en un hospital?
Yes.
It's right, isn't it, that you were not directly employed by the hospital, but you worked for an outsourced company.
¿Es correcto decir que no trabajaba directamente para el hospital, sino para una empresa subcontratista?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you begin by describing to us your normal working day before the pandemic?
¿Podría, por favor, comenzar a describir el día normal de trabajo antes de la pandemia?
Mi día normal de trabajo antes de la pandemia era 3 horas en cardiología, en el floor de cardiología.
My usual day before the pandemic was working in the cardiology floor 3 hours a day.
When the pandemic began, did your working hours increase?
Cuando comenzó la pandemia, ¿se aumentaron sus horas de trabajo?
Sí, debido a la situación que estábamos viviendo.
Yes, due to the situation we were going through.
How many hours did you have to start working?
¿Cuántas horas tuvo que empezar a trabajar?
Pues entraba normalmente 7, 6 de la tarde hasta 4, 3 de la mañana o 5, depende.
I would start work 6, 7 o'clock in the evening and go until 4, 5 in the morning, depending.
And that was how many days a week?
¿Cuántos días por semana era eso?
Normalmente 5 días, pero hay veces iba los fines de semana.
Usually for 5 days a week, but sometimes even weekends.
You said that before the pandemic you were cleaning one department in the hospital. Were you asked when the pandemic struck to clean more areas of the hospital?
Usted dijo que cuando antes de la pandemia trabajaba en un área del hospital.
Sí.
Después del comienzo de la pandemia se le pidió que trabajara en más áreas.
Vuelvo y repito que debido a la situación me vi obligada a trabajar más horas por la crisis que estábamos viviendo.
Due to the situation, I was obliged to work for more hours during the crisis we were going through.
You refer to the situation. I think it's right, isn't it, that the hospital was short-staffed at this time?
Usted se refiere a la situación. ¿Es correcto decir que en ese tiempo el hospital estaba corto de empleados?
Sí, corto de empleados por la enfermedad que se vivía.
Yes, short-staffed due to the illness we were suffering.
Is it right that many cleaners also were feeling too scared to go to work?
Y también es correcto decir que muchos limpiadores tenían miedo de ir a trabajar.
Sí, hubo falta de personal debido a la pandemia.
Yes, we were short of staff all due to the pandemic.
In your statement, you say this: I also didn't really want to work additional hours, but I felt pressured by the circumstances, and didn't feel able to say no.
En su declaración usted dice que usted realmente no quería trabajar más horas, pero se sintió presionada debido a las circunstancias y no sentía que podía decir que no.
Me vi debido a la situación y también por mis obligaciones, ¿no? Por la situación que uno vive aquí, el alquiler y mi familia también, que tenía yo que colaborar porque no era buena la situación tampoco.
Yes, because of the general circumstances, but also due to my own circumstances, having to pay rent, help my family, it was something to be considered.
I'd like to explore that a little bit.
Vamos a investigar esto un poquito más.
Ok, no problema.
What did you fear would happen if you had said no to working longer hours?
¿Qué piensa usted que hubiera pasado? ¿De qué tenía miedo usted si usted decía que no a la posibilidad de trabajar horas más largas?
De pronto a quedarme también sin trabajo porque todo se estaba cerrando.
I feared losing my job. Everything was closing down at the time.
Were you told which wards in the hospital were being used for treating patients with COVID-19?
¿Le dijeron a usted en qué salas del hospital había pacientes tratados con COVID?
No, no nos informaron absolutamente nada.
We had no information whatsoever.
Did that make you feel anxious?
Esto la hizo sentirse ansiosa.
Mucha ansiedad y no cogía ascensores porque me da mucho pánico.
Yes, I was very anxious. I didn't even take a lift because I had fear.
Did you ask your supervisor or anyone within the management of the hospital to tell you which wards were being used for treating patients with COVID-19?
¿Usted preguntó a su supervisor o a los gerentes del hospital en qué piso estaban los pacientes que se trataban por COVID?
No daban información, pero escuchaba rumores que de pronto en el cuarto piso.
They didn't provide information, but I heard rumors, just rumors, that perhaps they were all on the fourth floor.
As well as cleaning wards, I think it's right that you also cleaned individual rooms.
Aparte de la limpieza de salas, ¿usted también limpiaba habitaciones individuales?
Sí.
Yes.
Was the patient ever in the room when you were cleaning the individual rooms?
¿El paciente estaba en el cuarto cuando usted limpiaba?
No, cuando ya el paciente no estaba ahí.
No, the patient was no longer there.
And again, were you told whether the patient whose room you were cleaning had COVID-19?
¿Y le decían a usted si el paciente cuya habitación usted estaba limpiando era un enfermo de COVID?
No, no nos daban ninguna información
No.
de nada.
We didn't receive any information at all.
Did you receive any training about how to clean differently in accordance with COVID-19 guidelines?
¿Recibió usted algún entrenamiento, alguna formación de cómo limpiar de manera diferente de acuerdo con las reglas de COVID?
No, no nos dieron ninguna información, simplemente nos limitamos a limpiar a la manera de como nosotros lo hacíamos y lo que podíamos hacer al máximo.
No, we didn't have any information, and we just went on cleaning the way we were cleaning before, doing things to the best of our ability.
So you weren't, for example, given any new cleaning products?
Por ejemplo, no le dieron nuevos productos de limpieza.
Empezamos a utilizar un producto que se llama Difes y con eso limpiábamos todo.
Dijes.
Difes.
We started using a product called Dijes, and that's the one we use for everything.
Did you receive any guidance about infection prevention and control?
¿Usted recibió alguna guía en respecto de prevención de la infección y control de la infección?
No, no nos dieron ninguna guía ni información.
No, no guidance, no information.
In the absence of guidance about infection prevention and control and about how to clean in a COVID-19 compliant way, did you have concerns?
Y debido a que usted no recibió ninguna guía y tampoco recibió instrucciones de cómo limpiar en las circunstancias del COVID, ¿estaba usted preocupada?
Mucho, porque me daba mucho miedo contagiarme.
I was very worried. Had fear of being ill myself, contagious.
Did you raise the concerns you had with anyone at the hospital?
¿Usted mencionó estas preocupaciones a alguien del hospital?
No teníamos a quién informarle nada porque pues no había sino trabajar y trabajar.
We had nobody to speak to. All we had to do was work and work.
What about with anyone at the outsourced company?
¿Y con alguien de la compañía de subcontratista?
Tampoco. Ellos no, para nada.
No, nothing with them.
In your statement, you say this: despite my concerns, I didn't raise a complaint with my employers or with hospital management because I was scared there would be negative consequences.
Usted dice en su declaración que usted no mencionó sus preocupaciones al hospital o a los gerentes porque tenía miedo de las consecuencias.
Claro, porque imagínate quedarnos en ese momento sin trabajo, ¿con qué íbamos a mantenernos?
Yes, at that time I couldn't be without a job. We needed to support ourselves.
Do I take it that the negative consequence was that you feared you would lose your job?
Entonces las consecuencias negativas de las que tenía miedos era perder el trabajo.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yes.
If you had fallen ill with COVID-19, would you have been able to survive on the sick pay you were entitled to?
Si hubieras enfermado con COVID, ¿podrías haber sobrevivido con el dinero de enfermedad que se recibía?
No se sobrevivía al dinero porque lo que nos pagaban a nosotros era muy poco. O sea, no teníamos un sueldo que realmente lo mereciéramos. Ya.
No. We had a very small pay. We didn't have the salary we actually deserved.
Did you, in fact, manage to avoid catching COVID-19 during the pandemic?
Usted logró evitar el contagio con COVID durante la pandemia.
Gracias a Dios, sí. Me cuidaba lo que más pude con mi compañera.
Yes, thank goodness that was the case. I looked after myself and together with my colleague, my partner.
We'll come on to some of the ways that you looked after yourself.
Después vamos a hablar de algunas de las maneras en las que te cuidaste.
Dale.
Can I first ask you this? If you had fallen ill with COVID-19, would you have felt that you had to carry on working? Because if you didn't work, you wouldn't be paid your wage.
Si te hubieras contagiado con COVID, hubieras sentido la obligación de seguir trabajando porque si no, no podías sobrevivir.
Lo hubiera hecho porque tenía que sobrevivir.
I would have done so because I had to survive.
I'll come now to the personal protective equipment you were provided with.
Vamos ahora a hablar del PPE, que es la protección personal con la que...
Was there a difference in the PPE that outsourced workers like you received compared to what the employed clinical staff at the hospital were given?
¿Había alguna diferencia entre el equipo de protección personal que recibían ustedes, los que venían de la compañía de subcontratistas, comparados con el personal clínico del hospital?
Sí, solamente a nosotros nos dan las mascarillas azules para protegernos nomás.
Yes.
Teníamos que rebuscar cómo protegernos.
We only receive a mask, a blue mask, and we had to find by ourselves a way to protect ourselves.
Y eso que no la daban. Y eso que no la daban, la teníamos que coger.
And we were not actually given these masks. We had to pick them up ourselves, find them ourselves.
Find them outside of the hospital?
Encontrarlas fuera del hospital.
En recesión, ir a consultorios donde hubiera, coger donde había mascarillas porque que nos dieran la caja, nosotros tengan esta caja, ¿no?
They were not given to us. We had to pick them sometimes from reception, sometimes from some consulting room where there were some spares.
in addition to the mask, did you acquire any other PPE to give yourself greater protection?
Aparte de la mascarilla, ¿requerían ustedes algún otro tipo de protección, de equipo para tener más protección?
No, ellos no lo daban, pero yo tomaba de otra parte donde veía que le daba a mi compañera y para mí, protegernos lo que más podíamos. Al escondido cogíamos eso.
No, they wouldn't give us, or they didn't give us anything. But myself, together with my partner, will pick up things from places where they would be available.
What
But
kind,
hiding ourselves, we will pick them up.
what kind of things? What kind of things?
¿Qué tipo de cosas?
Gorros, los delantales, las mascarillas más fuertes. ya.
Hats, aprons, stronger masks.
You say they wouldn't give us. Were you and your colleagues asking for more PPE?
Cuando dices ellos no nos daban, ¿tú y tus colegas estaban pidiendo más equipo de protección?
No teníamos a quién pedirle porque el supervisor, estábamos con un supervisor y siempre ella decía que no, que más tarde y nunca nos daban nada. Entonces nosotros tomamos. Yo más que todo tomaba para mi compañera y para mí.
No, we had nobody to ask. We only had a supervisor that would say always, later on, later on. So it was mainly myself that would be picking up stuff for myself and my partner, my colleague.
Did you receive any training about how to wear PPE and how to safely dispose of it?
¿Usted recibió algún entrenamiento de cómo utilizar este PPE, esta ropa de protección, y cómo luego deshacerse de manera segura de esto?
No, pero a raíz de lo que uno va manejando, tirábamos en las bolsas de naranjas que son las de contaminación y eso lo hacíamos por iniciativa propia cuando nos quitábamos todo.
No, didn't receive any training, but we knew ourselves to use some orange bags that are for contaminated articles, and we will use those to dispose of ours.
Taking all of this together, can I ask you this? Did you feel safe performing your job?
Tomando todo esto en consideración, ¿se sentía usted segura cuando estaba trabajando en su...
No, nunca tenía seguridad de lo que me iba a pasar, ni estaba tampoco segura, pero tenía que hacer las cosas.
No,
Yeah.
I didn't have any feeling of safety, but I had to go ahead and do things.
Did you receive a testing kit at any point during the pandemic?
¿En algún momento durante la pandemia usted recibió algún equipo para hacer prueba de COVID?
Lo vinieron a dar ya mucho después, pero durante la pandemia no. Ya después que teníamos que hacernos la prueba, si estábamos, reportarlo y no más, pero eso fue mucho después.
Much later, not actually during the pandemic itself, but much later, we received some and we had to check and report if we were found contaminated.
How many boxes of testing kits did you personally receive?
Usted personalmente, ¿cuántas cajas de este equipo de prueba recibió usted?
Yo creo que por ahí unas 3 o 4, yo creo, si acaso, por ahí, pero no fue mucho tampoco.
I believe 3, perhaps 4, not many.
Can I move finally to ask you about your physical and mental well-being during this time?
Quiero ahora hacer preguntas sobre su estado físico y mental durante este tiempo.
Can you describe to us the impact that working during the pandemic had on your mental health?
Quiero que me describa, por favor, el impacto que este trabajo durante la pandemia causó en su salud mental.
Mucho porque a toda hora temía que me iba a enfermar y pues como colaboraba con mi familia y yo también la situación acá, entonces a toda hora, mejor dicho, me dio un estrés que no y bajé mucho de peso.
I suffered great impact from all this situation, this fear of becoming ill. I had an obligation towards my family. The whole thing caused a lot of stress. Eventually, I lost a lot of weight too, due to this stress.
Were you ever asked about your well-being by either the hospital management or the outsourced company you worked for?
¿Alguna vez, ya sea el hospital, la gerencia del hospital o la compañía subcontratista le preguntaron cómo estaba?
En ningún momento nos preguntaron nada, cómo estábamos.
At no time we had any questions from them or any inquiries from them.
Can I ask how that made you feel?
¿Y cómo se sintió usted debido a esto?
Se siente uno mal, pero yo llamé a una hermana que tengo y con ella mantenía relación de, como ella trabaja en Colombia también es enfermera, con ella mantenía y ella me decía, me daba mucho ánimo ya.
I had just the support of my sister. She works in Colombia as a nurse, and she was the one that supported me.
Do you think that you and your colleagues have received the recognition you deserve for the work you performed during the pandemic?
¿Piensa usted que usted y sus colegas han recibido el reconocimiento que merecen debido al trabajo que hicieron durante la pandemia?
Para nada.
Not
para
at all.
nada.
Not at all.
Finally, this, I think it's right, isn't it, that you and your colleagues are now employed directly by the hospital?
¿Correcto decir que usted y sus colegas ahora son empleados directos del hospital?
En este momento sí.
At this present time, yes.
Can you tell us how, if at all, that has improved your working conditions?
¿Puede decirnos si sus condiciones de trabajo han mejorado, si es que han mejorado?
No, o sea, ha mejorado de pronto en el pago, no como es debido, ¿no? Pero sí algo mejor que con la compañía que estamos y más o menos.
There has been some improvement in the payment, not as much as should be, but yes, better than before.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
No.
Can I just ask, was it a private hospital or an NHS hospital? Please don't name the hospital, but was it private or NHS?
Sin dar el nombre del hospital, ¿este era un hospital privado o un hospital de salud pública?
Pues que yo sepa es privado.
As far as I know, it's a private hospital.
Thank you. Those are all the questions we have.
Estas son todas las preguntas que te tienen que hacer.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your courage in coming forward to help us.
Te agradecemos tu coraje, tu valentía en estar aquí presente.
It is absolutely essential that we hear from a wide range of people who are working throughout the pandemic in hospitals. So we're very grateful.
Es esencial que escuchemos hablar a todos los tipos de personas que trabajaron en los hospitales a través de la pandemia y te agradecemos tu presencia.
Ok, dígale que muchas gracias, que porque es muy duro.
Thank you, and it's been very hard.
I can imagine. Thank you. I've been asked to rise while we wait for the next witnesses. I shall return as soon as we're ready. Scary.
Thank you.
I'm sorry about last week.
Could be better.
My lady, the next witness was in fact due to be Mrs. Leslie Moore, but due unfortunately to a family emergency, she's unable to attend today, and the inquiry will update both you and the court participants in due course once we're able to do so. Can we return then, please, to Professor Summers and Dr. St. Thurlingam? You are still under your oaths or affirmations that you made last week. And I'd like to start with you, Doctor, please, on the topic of advanced care planning and do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation. All right. And if it helps you, Doctor, we are starting at paragraph 37 in your report.
Okay.
Clearly, some people may find discussing this quite distressing, but so can we take our time and set out the principles, the legalities, and the realities at a steady and slow pace, if we may? All right. I'd like to ask you, please, about why advanced care planning is important generally, and then why it was particularly important by the time we came to the pandemic. So could we start there?
So I think the broadest way to look at it is that it's a way of ensuring the patient's informed wishes are taken into account when making what are inevitably time-critical decisions. By the nature of these conditions, they can happen quickly, so unexpectedly, and wherever possible, the patient's wishes and values, their own thoughts about what will happen to them and what outcomes and they would like should be known where possible.
So outside of the pandemic, one might, for example, embark on an advanced care plan if they know they have cancer and unfortunately that it's now in a terminal stage.
Yeah, so I think anyone who, for whatever reason, is nearing the end of their life, to their knowledge, or is at risk of death for whatever reason.
Now, there are various iterations of forms, but there's one I'd like to ask you about, acknowledging as I do that it is not the only form out there, but can we have a look, please, at the respect form? Mm-hmm. And can you just help us, please? What is this intended for? Mm-hmm.
So this is a model which, and to make this point, it really encapsulates what is already good practice. So it's not new policy. It doesn't. What it brings is a way of systematically looking at things which are already known to be important. And that includes establishing a shared understanding of the patient's condition, what outcomes they value and fear, importantly, and what medical treatments would benefit them. And it's a structured way of looking at that in a way that leads to be able to write down the information for reference when it becomes relevant.
Right. It has been, I think you say, implemented in parts of England and Scotland since 2016. And I think it is currently being implemented across Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. I'll deal with Wales separately, but let's just look at the form itself. Obviously, it's got the patient's details in there, the diagnosis or relevant information, communication aids, whether they need an interpreter. Would this also be used, for example, if someone had perhaps a support worker or needed someone to help communicate, perhaps if they were learning disabled? Would that information all be included in there?
Yes, I think anyone close to the patient and able to represent and firstly help them with the decision making and also able to represent them.
Right. And then there's a box for details of other relevant planning documents and where to find them. An advanced decision to refuse treatment is different, isn't it, as I understand it?
Yes, so that's a legal instrument, not so in Scotland, but would still be taken into account. So the sort of legal framework may differ. But unlike a lot of these other documents, which broadly we can consider called treatment escalation plans, the advanced decision to refuse treatment is legally binding for the condition it applies for, it's important to say. So maybe for very particular circumstances only.
Right, so someone could say, for example, I don't want to have chemotherapy. To take it outside of a pandemic context, they could make an advanced decision to refuse treatment, and that would be binding, and therefore they would not have chemotherapy. Is that correct?
Yes, so they have legally declared they're not consenting, which is different to a statement of values and preferences.
Okay. Organ donation may also be discussed. And then there's the section dealing with personal preferences, where people explain what is important to them, quality of life, that they might want to be able to do this, but not that. Can you give us some examples of what might be included in that box there?
So if a discussion, for example, was around instituting mechanical ventilation, something that might lead to them to be weaker than they are already, then they might say, actually, if the risk is, there's no certain outcomes, but if there's a substantial risk that I'm going to be worse off than I am now, even if I survive the intensive care process, as an example, and I wouldn't wish to be living under those conditions, I would only want aggressive treatment if it left me fully able to do certain activities, then that's to be taken into consideration. It's not an absolute bar, but it provides their input into the decision.
Right. And then it goes on to the clinical recommendations, and who fills in that part of the form?
So really this is about, although it's signed by a clinician, the purpose of all these documents is to establish a shared understanding and an expression of values and preferences. So it would be done with the patient, or those close to them, or both, but it's filled in and signed by the clinician.
Right. And then we can see the boxes for signature. And if we look to just pause there, please, just come down slightly. I just want to look at the box that's ringed in red, where CPR attempts are not recommended. So this form can be used for someone to indicate whether they would want CPR, but it is not a do not attempt CPR form, is it?
Yes, it includes the same information, and in a way it's wider. And one of the benefits of this sort of document is it it avoids a DNA CPR document in isolation becoming sort of accidentally seen as a proxy for wider treatment decisions. So by expressly including all of those and then including the CPR part as one end of the treatment process, it puts it all into context.
Right. All right. And then we can see there that as we go on to page 2, there is reference to the capacity of the person at the time that the respect form is being filled in, and then various options depending on who's involved in it and the capacity of the person. Now, respect forms and those like this, who are they ordinarily filled in by?
So by clinicians, but in terms of which clinicians, really those in the best position to do it at the time,
Right.
which, due to the nature of critical illness, and it may obviously involve treatment other than critical care, really as early as possible when it becomes relevant. So it may be somebody with a stable condition that they want to have taken into account. It may be somebody who's come into hospital with an acute condition, in which case really as close to the front door as possible.
So
they're able to take
a GP could fill this in with a patient, or if you were going through cancer treatment, you might fill it in with someone who's providing that treatment for you.
Yes.
Clearly slightly different considerations by the time we get to critical care, potentially.
Yeah.
All right. So, and this form, where does it stay? Or whose records?
I think that's an important point about this. So the intention of the respect form, although similar, is that it's transportable. It stays with the patient. They themselves would have a copy. Where there are electronic systems across regions, then it would be part of that, such as an electronic care plan. And that contrasts with, so it's an advantage over something like a DNA CPR form, which is very specific to an institution. So
Right.
you may need different ones for the ambulance service, ones for a hospital.
So we're going to look at a DNA CPR form in a moment. But do I understand it correctly that if I went into hospital and I had a respect form, if they called up my records, they should find the respect form within them?
It does depend on the information systems, but also in an ideal world, you would have a copy with you and you'd be in a position to highlight it and say, look, here's my understanding of things at the moment.
Fine. Okay. This is a form in England, Scotland, and being rolled out in Northern Ireland. Can we just consider the position in Wales? There is an all-Wales DNA CPR policy, which is different, and I'll come back to that. But is there any equivalent of respect or a form like it operating in Wales?
So the overarching principle of this is Resuscitation Council UK, who I know you have as witness subsequently. They have adopted this as their recommendation for all 4 nations. I think in terms of the implementation, my understanding is that the All Wales DNA CPR form is under review as of June 2024.
Right.
And certainly the expert recommendation from the Resuscitation Council is that it should be considered across all the nations.
Why would it help to have a form like respect working across all 4 nations?
In a practical sense, people obviously may travel across borders, and I think it's also about just establishing shared best practice. So even if you never leave home, so to speak, if it works in one place, the principle should apply elsewhere. It's probably worth emphasising this is, as we said, one form among many, and it's a way of capturing what are already existing principles. So it's about best practice rather than new policy.
Fine. Whatever the actual format of the form, are they all asking similar questions and have similar considerations set out in them? I understood. And I think in your statement, you say there is a treatment escalation plan document created by one of the health boards that was adapted after COVID-19 and now carries the All Wales NHS logo. And that applies in hospitals in Wales. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
All
yes.
right. Okay. Now, clearly we've seen on that respect form reference to DNA CPRs, and I'd like to ask you, please, about DNA CPRs and some basics, please, if I may, Doctor. Is this the position, though, that, in fact, if you have a cardiac arrest outside of hospital, the survival rate is relatively low, somewhere around 8%?
Yes.
And if you indeed have a cardiac arrest and your heart stops in hospital, survival rate is higher, but it's still only 23%.
Yes.
All right. Now, the DNA CPR, is this right, means that cardiopulmonary resuscitation should not be started for that particular patient or continued. Can you help me why there might be circumstances where someone has a DNA CPR, but nonetheless CPR has started and therefore needs to be stopped.
So CPR in itself is clearly very time critical, life-saving in those situations where it does work, but only when started promptly. So where there's any doubt, the presumption is always to start, which is why paper DNA CPR forms often have red borders so they can easily be identified. In electronic systems, they're sort of flagged prominently so that you know in advance, or it's easy to spot. But if
Pause
there's
there.
any...
We'll pull one up on screen, even though we're going to talk to, just so that everyone can follow what you're saying. Could we have INQ 227411, please? I won't go through the detail, but we can just look at one so we can see. 227411. That's not page 23. Sorry, it's my fault. There we are. All right. This is an example of a DNA CPR form, and we can see there clearly the red border. And where does that go on the patient's notes?
It can be in any particular place, but it should be easily identifiable. And to return to your previous question, the scenario where CPR may be stopped is where it has been started because the patient's observed to collapse. Appropriately, people may start if they weren't aware of the existence of this form, but once it's found, then it would be an indication to stop. So that's a scenario where that might arise.
Right, so the patient would be treated, but if someone had to go and locate the notes for whatever reason and then realise there was a DNA CPR, that would be a circumstance in which you'd stop. You wouldn't just leave the patient without any treatment.
Yes.
Pending location of the form, I understood. And in fact, this form says on it, it must be filled in at the front of the patient's healthcare record.
Yes,
so we'd hope it'd be somewhere visible. All right.
And it's worth saying that the verbal information about this, although it should be backed up obviously by the document, is often part of handovers and ward safety briefings and so on. So the information will be passed on from shift to shift, as it were, or at handover.
Okay. All right. Now, I think there are different circumstances in which a DNA CPR notice may be made. Is this right? Firstly, they can be made in advance where the person has the capacity to say, I don't want CPR.
Yes.
All right. And we've looked at an example of that on the respect form. Someone may come to that decision of their own volition.
Yes.
All right. And if someone comes to that decision, is that decision respected? It is.
Yes. And for them to come to that decision, they should obviously be able to have all the information about their condition, which they have themselves, but to have clinical scenarios explained to them that might be relevant to this if they're acutely ill or things are deteriorating. And it's about access to support as well, having written information where feasible. So again, it all comes to the benefits of having that discussion early.
Early. All right. Understood. Now, there may also be circumstances, though, where it is a medical treatment decision made by clinicians such as yourselves that CPR should not be offered because it is not clinically appropriate. And I want to be clear about that. In the circumstances where a clinician says, we shouldn't do CPR because it won't work, does the patient or their loved one have to consent to that clinical treatment decision?
No, they should be aware of it and should be able to be involved in it and, if necessary, question it. But they don't specifically consent to it, but it's about what treatment may be clinically appropriate and is on offer, so to speak.
Am I right, though, that the law does require the patient, if they have capacity, or their carers' loved ones, to be consulted
Yes.
where a clinician has decided that there should be a DNA CPR notice?
Yes.
Right. And is this the position? A patient or loved one cannot demand CPR if it would be clinically inappropriate?
That's right. It's a treatment decision, and the treatment itself, it's not a switch where you simply decide to save someone's life. It's a treatment process, often quite intrusive, and it's like any other treatment. You do it because you think it'll work.
Just sorry to interrupt. You say it's a legal requirement that a patient should be consulted before the decision is taken. Just looking at the form, I appreciate that there are several boxes which include having discussions with those close to the patient at box 4, for example. But I'm just a bit concerned. Box 1, or question 1, has the patient appointed a health and welfare attorney to make decisions on their behalf? If yes, they must be consulted. Mm-hmm. Surely that is not highlighting the fact that there's a legal requirement for loved ones or the patient to be consulted by just taking the health and welfare attorney example. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, indeed. I think the issue of chronology is my understanding of this is that this shouldn't come as a surprise, if you like, to the patient or those close to them after the event. It's not necessarily the same as saying they must be consulted first, so they should be made aware of it. And I agree, it should be anyone that's in a position to be a representative of the patient if they themselves can't take part in that discussion.
I just wonder if that form should be clearer.
I think the other important thing is that this is just one do not resuscitate form of many from a particular organisation. I don't think there is one unified.
They won't necessarily be the same.
It won't necessarily be the same in every single institution. This is one example
No.
of such a form.
Yes.
I'm just...
So this one, for example, does not refer to loved ones, families, carers and the like. And people with power of attorney are in a potentially slightly different category. It doesn't even mention that. But I don't want everyone to be confused between who has to be consulted and... so can we just... I was going to look at the form, if I may, my lady, and just go through some of the boxes. But does the patient have capacity to make and communicate decisions? If they do, then they should be consulted. Is that the position?
Yes.
Right. If they don't, you have to see whether there is an advance decision to refuse treatment, in which case that would be legally binding, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. Do they have a health and welfare attorney, potentially called different things across the 4 nations?
Yes, this is a Welsh document, isn't it?
All right. This is a Welsh document, yep. To make decisions on behalf. But if they do have the health and welfare attorney in Wales or power of attorney in some of the other countries, then they must be consulted. Is that correct?
It's correct, and it's worth making the point at this stage, which is relevant to other discussions as well. The patient's capacity can be a stable, fixed condition, or it can change. So if somebody's confused and delirious on one day, they may not be the next. And if they're even with the attorney involved, if the patient has capacity on the day, then that takes precedence.
But to follow up to her ladyship's question, in fact, nothing on here about has the patient's family, loved one, carer been consulted, and that ought to happen legally, as I understand it.
I think so. It's touched on in question 4 in terms of asking the question, but it says those close to the patient rather than specifying who that should be. So.
Family, loved one, carer, right? It could be any one of the aforementioned. All right. Then the clinician has to fill in why CPR would be inappropriate, unsuccessful, or not in the patient's best interests. Has the discussion taken place with the patient, yes or no? If it has not been discussed, that ought to be recorded in the form. And presumably would say, patient is ventilated, patient's unconscious,
Yes.
something along those lines.
Yes.
Has an appropriate discussion taken place with those close to the patient, a health and welfare attorney or an IMCA? I'm afraid I'm not familiar with IMCA. Can you help with that?
It's an independent advocate for somebody who may lacking
Thank you.
capacity.
And then it's filled in, as we can see, by the healthcare professional. And they have to give various of their details. Cancellation of decision. Can I ask you about that? In what circumstances would a DNA CPR be cancelled?
So the factors leading into that discussion are partly around the underlying condition of the patient, but also about their acute condition. And it may be their severity at that stage is such that it's felt that they wouldn't benefit further from CPR if, for example, they're already receiving maximum life support on intensive care. If their heart stops at the end of that, it may be that it's felt that that's not going to benefit. However, if they then, under the existing treatments, get better, then it may be, and if that acute condition was part of the reason for the DNA CPR, then that may easily be reversed. So it's very much a live document that's always under review.
And who makes the decision to cancel the DNA CPR?
Really the same set of clinicians who institute it, potentially. So it may have been a DNA CPR that was set up on a ward. They come to intensive care, things change. So really the clinician looking after the patient at that time.
Right. And then box 8, copies of the DNA CPR decision have been sent to the patient carer, GP, nursing or care home. And in a hospital setting, is there someone responsible for sending the DNA CPR to the patient or their carer and the GP?
I think it...
or is that either or?
Yeah, so either or. And I think it comes under sort of discharge management and sharing information when the patient leaves the institution.
And then if we just keep scrolling down slightly, all boxes must be completed. In the event of cardiac or respiratory arrest, no CPR will be made. All other treatment and care will be provided. And clearly, I think you've made the point a number of times already in your report that a decision to not perform CPR is not the same as not treating someone
Yes.
in all other respects. All right. And then there's various other parts of the form that I don't need to trouble you with. Now, we've looked at this in a rather sterile and non-pandemic situation, but can I ask you, please, about how one fills in this form in critical care settings? And perhaps, Professor, if I can come to you. If someone is brought into critical care and is not getting better, pre-pandemic, can you give us an example of how you would discuss DNA CPRs with the patient's family?
So, as you rightly point out, it is often in the critical care setting with the patient's loved ones rather than with the patient themselves, because at that point they've been so compromised that they're unable to participate in the discussions because they don't have capacity. And I suppose talking you through the nuts and bolts of how one does that, you usually would be meeting face to face wherever possible with those family and loved ones. And the place in which I would normally start those conversations is to ask the loved ones what's their understanding about the clinical situation in which we are, so that we can all start from the same place. Sometimes they have just attended the intensive care unit in an emergency. They aren't fully up to speed with how their loved one ended up here. And so it's important for everyone to clarify their understanding about the circumstances that have brought us to the point we need to have this conversation. And once we have clarified that, I feel that everybody understands what has happened and why we are all in the room having this conversation, I then ask, have the patient or their loved ones ever discussed what they would want at the end of their life? What are their values? What are the things that they would say if they were not here, or if they were here and they're not able to contribute? And very often people haven't ever discussed this as a family. And so we are asking the loved ones, as the people who know the patient best, given that we've rarely met them when they're well in a critical care setting, what do you think they would say if they were able to contribute to this conversation? I'm usually very clear that I am not asking the family to make a decision, that the burden of that decision is made about what's clinically appropriate by the doctors, and explain very clearly that that's my responsibility. I'm not asking them to carry that burden, and nor should anyone, because they're asking them to make a decision about someone for whom they love and care for very much at a time of great distress. But it's important that they have the opportunity to input into that decision, and then explain, having heard what they have said and reflected on what they've said about but what they think the patient would think, or any discussion that has ever happened. I explain my viewpoint on the situation as a clinician, that actually taking everything into consideration, I do or do not feel that resuscitation is appropriate in this particular scenario.
All right, now pausing there, if a clinical decision is made by someone like you that there should be a DNA CPR and the patient's loved ones disagree, can they ask for a second opinion?
Absolutely, yes.
And if a second clinician comes along and says, no, I think it's clinically inappropriate, at that point is the DNA CPR notice made?
Yes, but I would say that we would make tremendous effort to try and reach an agreed understanding of the situation. I don't think it's in anybody's interests for there to be wild disagreement, because this is the family's loved ones. Trying to explain why we are where we are is important.
Now, in pandemic times, I suspect there was not the time, well, there wasn't the bedside conversation or in a side room. How did you practically go about having DNA CPR discussions with loved ones, perhaps over Zoom or some other kind of remote meeting? Can you tell us how you went about it and how you found it?
This was one of the most extraordinarily difficult parts of ICU care in the pandemic. very often the loved ones of our patients had last seen them when they were leaving home to come into hospital. And at that point, often they were conscious, they were talking, and they were in a very different state to they are at the point that we're contacting them to have this conversation. That differs enormously from usual clinical practice when the patient's loved ones would often have been at the bedside and seen that deterioration over days. And remember, very often people who came into intensive care for COVID had been in hospital for a few days beforehand, so they had deteriorated over some days and then come to us because of the course of the clinical illness.
So
they wouldn't have seen any of that.
So it may have come as a real shock.
Yeah.
When you have to make the call or speak to them on the Zoom, that you're having to even have the conversation, never mind the actual detail of the conversation. And how did those conversations go when you had to speak to the loved ones?
They were hard because you have never been in the same room as that individual. They have someone who, therefore, they have not met, talking to them about a situation that they have not been able to witness over a period of days in a very remote and disconnected way, either via telephone or via Zoom. And we were having to have these conversations in greater number than you would ordinarily, because the number of patients in critical care was greater and the level of severity of the illness and the outcomes were overall worse than would be for the usual ICU population. So you would have done several ward rounds and then be making several of these calls in the course of a day to explain to a family the situation their loved one was in. It was not easy for the families or for the healthcare staff.
No. Well, I was going to ask you, who was actually, obviously you may have made some calls yourself, but was there a set person that had to make the call? Was it always the clinician? Was there other people supporting in this role during the pandemic? Do you know?
Different hospitals and institutions organised how they did this differently. Some hospitals set up family liaison teams where they had non-critical care physicians having conversations with families about that. We chose not to do that in the hospital in which I work, and as the critical care consultants and medical team, we made those phone calls.
Right. Okay. Can I ask you, Professor, since you're speaking, do you personally have any experience or are aware of blanket use of DNA CPRs in your hospital?
I do not.
Right. And Dr. Santharalingam, do you have any personal experience? No. We've heard of them, clearly in a number of respects. Can I ask you this? The inquiry has also heard there are some examples of families whose patients have been discharged and have subsequently found out that there is a DNA CPR on their record. What is the circumstances? What's the process then if someone says, well, there's one on my record and I'm awake now and I'm alert and I'm better? How does one go about having a DNA CPR notice reviewed? I don't know if Professor or Doctor, whichever of you feels best able to speak to this.
I think it means going through the institution where it was generated, so in this likely in an acute hospital, and through the services of that hospital. So there are patient liaison services or an email to the chief executive, and so whatever is required to get in touch with the hospital through existing routes, and they can then take it from there.
Right. So if it was made in a hospital, they ought to contact the hospital. If it was made by a GP, go back to the GP and any other settings and every other setting in between. Right. Can I ask you about the CQC findings?
Sorry, just before you do. I've also heard from a large number of bereaved families that not only did they find out about the DNA CPR notice on their loved ones' records, but that they weren't consulted or no discussion took place with them. And they knew that their loved one was not in a position to have had any discussion. Are you aware of situations where notices were put on without any discussion with the patient because the patient didn't have capacity and without any discussion with the family member?
I think it depends on context. So I think in our clinical setting of critical care, because we're very hands-on with the patients and the situation is changing every day, the sort of discussions the professor describes would have been had. There may be some slip through the net, but it wouldn't be the normal case. I think some of the examples you've had may have been from other settings where there may be fewer people looking after large numbers of patients. So can't really comment on that, but I would think in our setting it would be very unusual.
So, and is your setting
Intensive care.
a large teaching hospital?
No, I think clinical setting, regardless
Clinical
of site, actually is only intensive care unit.
Oh, I see. Okay, you're
These
talking about the
discussions, yes.
specific. Right, okay.
Yeah, so these sort of discussions are really part and parcel, and that's not to say there wouldn't be for other people, but it may have been a DNA CPR decision that was in records from much earlier, maybe made in a very different setting. It's difficult to comment without knowing. What
So
the
they could have been
examples
made
were.
in a setting, a ward, where maybe the staff weren't used to, as you're obviously, sadly, all too used to this kind of discussion, or process, but they could have been made in situations where the staff weren't as familiar with the process that needs to be gone through.
Potentially, and I think some of the potential benefits of widespread treatment escalation planning, such as a respect form, part of that includes normalising these discussions, not only for the public and the patients themselves, but also for all staff in all areas. So it becomes part of the process of healthcare for those patients where it's appropriate, so they're at risk of dying.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all, because actually it alights on exactly what I was going to ask about with the CQC findings. Could we call on screen 474-255_27? And my lady will recall there was an interim report and then a final report done by the CQC, and it really just picks up on the questions your ladyship was posing. But the CQC found that the healthcare professionals they spoke to recognised the importance of assuring the conversations around advanced clinic, but how well people were involved in the conversations about their care and whether or not they wanted to receive CPR varied. Some people experienced compassionate, person-centred care, where they were fully involved, and then there were others that there did not happen, and they found it hugely distressing. In these cases, they say conversations took place at short notice, people did not fully understand what was happening or what a DNA CPR was. Having the time and information to talk about what care and support people want and need to have a dignified and peaceful death is essential. And can I ask you both this? Do you agree with the CQC's conclusion there about trying to talk about this when we're not in a pandemic situation with stretch ratios, where people have seen someone leave in an ambulance and then see them potentially on a ventilator? Is this really all about talking about death and how we'd like to die in advance of the urgent, critical situation that we ended up in the pandemic?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's worth just starting with the point that I believe this was the CQC report about what was happening in nursing and care homes,
right,
and at an earlier stage of the pandemic,
yep,
and things did improve after, so it partly reflects the sort of multitude of policies and changes early on. But I think your wider point, absolutely agree. And it is worth saying this is a positive discussion as well. It's about how people want their last days of life to be and whether the CPR is something they want as the means of their death, which unfortunately is often the case, or whether they would rather die at home without intervention. So obviously those answers will vary a lot depending on the patient's medical condition itself, their values and wishes. So it's really a positive discussion around, and it's a society-wide discussion around death, really. And I agree, if the more open and prevalent that is, and people not feeling embarrassed to talk about it with their family members, the more likely it will be that these sort of situations don't arise in a crisis.
Well, the CQC report goes on to refer to a lack of training and support for staff, and how confident they were in holding these conversations has impacted on the quality of people's experience. Now, you two, I'm afraid, have to deal with this more often than a number of other staff. But can I ask you, who practically do you think should be responsible for training those that aren't working in critical care or end-of-life treatment? Who would be responsible for providing that kind of training? The Trust, the hospital, NHSE, the regulators?
So communication training and having conversations such as this actually is a core part of the medical training curriculum for medical students as set out by, I think, the General Medical Council. So actually it is a training thread that should go through, certainly for doctors, and I would argue other healthcare professionals too, throughout their training. We are required in the nature of our work to have all kinds of difficult conversations with people around death and other personal issues. And I don't think saying it was just the responsibility of trusts is broad enough. I think that actually it should be embedded as a core part of professional education.
I was going to say, do you have to do continuing professional
Yes.
education? Is it part currently of any continuing professional education programme that you're aware of?
Certainly the matrix for intensive care physicians and members of the Royal College of Physicians includes having these skills on keeping up to date with both the legal and the professional best practice.
It's worth adding the point that I think those who generated the respect form would say that as part of implementation of that, we were talking about Four Nations implementation, that funded training by institutions, organisations supporting the trusts and health boards and employers is a key part of it as well. And there's a wider point behind that, which is whether it's about DNA CPR or around treatment escalation planning, having clinician time to actually have these conversations. Clearly in a pandemic, certain things apply, but in normal life, it's making sure the time is there to have those conversations as well as the training.
All right. Thank you. Can I move to a different topic with you, Doctor? And it's the work that you undertook in March 2020 in relation to a clinical prioritisation tool that you were asked to consider working on some guidelines for by, I think, the Chief Medical Officer. And we heard it from Professor Whitty 2 weeks ago now. And I said then we were hearing from the person involved, or one of the three involved. Can I just start by this? I think it's obvious from what you've said that clinicians make decisions about who should be admitted to care on a daily basis. And I think you told us last time that you would have a discussion with the ward if the ward thought the patient was deteriorating, and you'd be involved then in deciding whether it was appropriate for the person to be admitted to ICU. Now, yesterday, I think you are aware that we heard about a NICE guideline to assess patients when they're admitted to hospital to consider whether they might need critical care. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
All right. Now, that is not the same thing as the tool that you were working on, that Professor Whitty did. And as I understand it, you were asked to draw up guidance in the event that critical care was saturated.
That's right. And in fact, it was the lead for it was Professor Whitty, and he was kind enough to comment on it 2 weeks ago, as you say, saying that it was difficult, but he felt the outcome at the time was useful and sensible. It was for the Four Nations, so it was the quintet of 4 CMOs and the National Medical Director.
And if I understand it, I think on the 21st of March, you and 2 other colleagues were asked to form a group to consider the clinical prioritisation model to be used in the event that the NHS critical care resources were saturated, by which I mean there was no bed available.
Yes.
And we've heard about the NHS being in CritCon 4. And is it this that the tool was designed to address?
Yes, and in fact, the wider framework that was very much part of this work, so bearing in mind this was very early on in the pandemic, and at that point numbers were rising, and in fact the framework very explicitly tied CritCon and mutual aid to the potential trigger for a tool. So it wasn't the tool in isolation, it was pairing those two things so that there was an operational context to what might then be needed.
I just wanted to, can I perhaps put it more simply? Was this designed in the event that there was no bed anywhere and you had 2 people vying for 1 bed?
Essentially, yes.
All right, now that's a very heartless way, I appreciate, of describing it, but that's what we're talking about here. And no other bed in a neighbouring hospital, or indeed a neighbouring region that could be sensibly someone transferred to.
That's right, and in the context that mutual aid and decompression would already have happened, so essentially talking about even demand across the country, which would be a very extreme scenario.
Exactly. We looked at all the transfers and the rising numbers, and indeed we looked at the circular diagram of the example of Northwick Park and the number of other hospitals that they transferred patients to. But assuming in that example that there was no other bed available, and CritCon 4 had been declared, this was when the tool was envisaged to operate. Is that correct?
That's correct. And 2 things to emphasise. Firstly, CritCon 4 is a national situation, not just in that hospital. We've talked about scenarios where CritCon might be triggered as an alerting tool, but where CritCon 4 is agreed by those in authority to be a national state. And then the other point to make is this is all time sensitive, so it's really about queuing for the next available bed, and that might change when a bed comes up. So it's not about barring people from being admitted, it's saying who do we admit into the beds available right now.
perhaps if we look at how the tool was envisaged to work by reference to your paragraph 110, Doctor, and could we call up on screen? Thank you very much. A summary of how the framework was proposed. I won't necessarily go through all of these, but we can see there it was designed to effectively only operate once CritCon 4 was declared in one or more regions, and where CritCon 4 is declared, NHS England in this case have to be notified so that they know the position, and all other possible sources of mutual aid between hospitals have been exhausted.
That's right.
This really is in extremis.
That's right. And although the CritCon was a sort of convenient vocabulary for this, obviously for the other three nations, it's around that same information being escalated in other ways about capacity and saturation.
It makes the point there at 110.2, there should be no triage until every accessible ICU is full.
Absolutely. Yep.
The assessment should be based on accurate collection and communication of realistic frontline ICU conditions using CritCon or equivalents, rather than abstract bed counts against a theoretical bed base. What were you getting at there, if I may ask?
It was the discussion we had earlier, really, about having, although it's useful to think in terms of notional surge capacity, those are sort of fairly abstract numbers, and if units are becoming realistically saturated under the conditions at the time, that's what's going to start influencing clinical decision-making, albeit subconsciously, and in practical terms through simple lack of available beds. So that's what is the realistic frontline conditions in the view of those working there that needs to feed into this level of decision making.
All right.
And sort of percentages of notional total surge capacity may not help with that.
And then 110.4, if critical care resources become exhausted nationally, any declared critical prioritisation would operate on a ranking basis in the event of needing to prioritise one patient over another when competing for the same resource. In effect, the last ICU bed. What was that trying to convey?
It's really the point we made earlier that this is reflecting, this is not about triaging people in the sense of saying they will never get an intensive care bed, unless that is the clinically appropriate scenario in any case. But under pandemic conditions, it's not about ruling people in or out. It's saying for the next available bed, who should take precedence over somebody else on grounds of survivability using these principles.
In the scenario where you have two patients and both are eligible and it's appropriate to escalate them to ICU, you would use the tool to say, well, that person should be number one to get that bed, and then when one becomes available, the next person gets it. Is that how it was meant to work?
Yes, and the tool in its final form was about expected to survive or likely to survive versus may or may not survive versus unlikely or not expected to survive. So it's really just a verbal description rather than a numerical score, and using that you would use it as a ranking system in the scenario that you found yourself.
Okay. Was it ever envisaged that the tool would say that someone should be taken out of ICU? Was that part of the framework you were considering?
No, and it is so under the label of reverse triage, it's a concept, and people did raise whether we should, but in the context of this, no, it wasn't, and it was, in this case, I think too difficult to put into a structured form that would make sense to people at the time.
So you were not asked, nor did you, in fact, I think, consider the possibility of having to take someone off a ventilator, for example, to make room for others. That's not what the tool was designed for. Understood. All right. And so effectively it was a ranking system for who should get the next bed available whilst there were these extreme conditions.
That's right. And I think in terms of, although we quite appropriately talk about beds, it's really about starting a treatment process in a resort-limited setting in CritCon 4 in extremis.
Now, can I ask you, why is it important to have a tool?
So I think the benefits are, firstly, transparency, both within the profession and also to the public, and particularly those who might be disadvantaged in general. So even if people may not agree with it or like it, the fact that they can see it, I think, is important. And that replaces any risk of subconscious bias or unseen decision-making. So firstly, there's one of transparency. Secondly, there's one of efficacy, which is by publishing something and having a plan, it may be adapted and modified and improved and disputed if necessary, but you have to work with what is available, and it means that what we do have is the best we could manage at the time.
Can I pause you there? Do I take it from that prior to the pandemic, there was no in extremis saturation tool available?
No.
All right.
Thirdly, I would say there's reassurance in two forms. One is for clinicians to know that even if you're saying this is usual conditions, we're not saturated yet, for clinicians to know that there is some sort of plan for what happens next means, firstly, that means that they don't feel that sense of moral doubt and injury, potentially worrying that they'll find themselves in that situation on their own in the middle of the night at their site. They know there is a plan. Secondly, for the public and for patients, it gives them the safety that people aren't going to find themselves in a position of being triaged inappropriately. If there is a national plan and people know when it's switched on, when it's switched off, that only the CMOs can activate it, it protects the public by avoiding the risk that by not talking about something, it sort of happens unseen.
Is there any, do you know, will or desire amongst the medical profession to have a tool such as this in case we find ourselves again in a situation where we are overflowing in ICU beds?
I would say yes. Obviously, having been involved in that particular point of view, but I think genuinely looking at wider discussions, there was a need for it. And to be clear, it's not about the tool that you pick up and start using on your own. It's knowing that there is a plan in the background that may be activated, and I think that in itself provides reassurance for people.
Okay. I think just to finish this topic, albeit the only 7 days where the framework was being considered by your group, I think you say that the group consulted with the critical care professional community, age and disability groups, and with the Department of Health and Social Care's Moral and Ethical Advisory Group. And there were various changes made to the putative framework during that period as a result of those meetings. Just finally on this topic then, did your work as part of that group effectively form a starting point for a document that is now in existence, which is the clinical guidance published by the Intensive Care Society?
That's correct. So when on the 28th of March, when the work for the quintet of CMOs and National Medical Director was stood down on the grounds that at that stage it looked as if the first wave was seceding and that the tool wouldn't be needed, there was a discussion around publishing it so that it could continue to be developed openly and with as much professional and public input as possible by a professional society. The Intensive Care Society took that on, but in consultation with as many other groups as was possible. What was originally published, firstly as a guideline from the Intensive Care Society, endorsed by the Royal College of Physicians.
Well, and pause there, because we'll have a look at it. Could I have on screen, please, INQ 395282? Just before you're about to tell us who it was endorsed by, this was obviously not the framework that you worked on in that week in March 2020, but it's effectively using your work. This guidance was then developed based on it. Is that correct?
That's correct. And in the context that if national guidance at NHS level were to be required, then this provides a starting point to pick up and start from this rather than from a blank page. So it would be sort of relevant to looping back again if necessary, so to speak.
And I think this guidance came out on the 28th of May 2020. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we can see there that it's endorsed by Royal College of Physicians, the Scottish Intensive Care Society, the Welsh Intensive Care Society, All Wales Trauma Critical Network, the National Critical Care Works of England and North of Ireland. So a UK-wide document. It is entitled Assessing Whether COVID-19 Patients Will Benefit from Critical Care, an Objective Approach. But is it solely for use during a respiratory pandemic that involves COVID-19?
No, I would say, and there are three elements to this, and I think also to reassure anyone listening, the guidance has the same elements as the original framework, which is including the shared escalation, the mutual aid, the fact that any decision tool would only apply in CRITCON 4. So if somebody was to pick this up and use this today, they would say, well, we're at CRITCON 2 or 3, therefore usual decision-making applies. Nobody's should be going to the back page and using the tool on its own. But in that context, in terms of applicability, the document has statements of moral and ethical principles, which are applicable to any crisis, and potentially outside a crisis. It has a statement about shared escalation, mutual aid, the CRITCON framework, which are also should apply to any crisis. And then the tool at the end is specific to COVID and will need to be reassessed, redesigned, as indeed it would have done during the pandemic itself if it were in use, because it was based on available data at March the 28th. And would in any case have been adapted. For a different disease, there would be different criteria, different things to look at.
So barring the, I think it's Appendix 2, if we just look at it at page 12 of the document, there is the decision support aid in relation to COVID. Mm-hmm. But essentially, if one looked at pages 1 to 11, mm-hmm. they would be applicable, whatever the virus, whatever the disease, whatever the extremist circumstances underpinning it.
Yes.
And then you could come to this. So you could basically use pages 1 to 11 and then add on an appendix to be specific to whatever circumstance was appropriate.
I think so. And I don't know, would it be useful to look at page 11 briefly?
Yeah, so, yeah, let's go back to that then, because that's a more general application.
Yes. And to some extent, this is just a further version of the discussion about CRICON that we had previously. But I think the bits to highlight here are that usual decision-making applies in CRICON 0 to 3 with the sort of blue arrow saying that. And then CRICON 4, and in fact that table we just looked at the back, the decision aid only applies at a stage of sort of universal CRICON 4 as declared by at sort of government level.
So if I follow you correctly, Doctor, if we go down to the 4 triage risk, all in red there, we're at CRICON 4, it's only then that you would turn over to Appendix 2 and follow the tool for whatever disease or virus or situation was necessary.
Absolutely, and the logic of having it there so that you can talk about it openly, in order to avoid having to use it, so that everyone's at least aware of what we'd be facing if we got to that position.
Can I just then finish on this topic? There is this prototype that could be adapted in the event of future need. I think you make the point in your statement that there is a potential benefit to discussing this in non-pandemic times, and you said it could be done with publicly accountable oversight. Who did you envisage might provide that oversight?
So we, in a sense, are very open to sort of expert opinion on how this could be implemented, but some form of public commission or stakeholder meeting with a very wide buy-in from interested members of the public, particularly those representing disability and other potentially disadvantaged groups, and to make sure that all sections of society are involved. There is some academic work which suggests that actually the public may be sort of ahead of the profession in things that they might want to have considered. So these are purely from a research paper from Oxford, but they found ideas coming up were around prioritising people with young children or even healthcare workers, and they wanted to talk about things like taking people off ventilators. I'm not advocating for that, but it's interesting that the discussion beyond the profession can be wider than the discussion that we ourselves have.
I wonder if we could leave that topic there. And my lady, I'm moving to a new topic. It's a little early, but I can start the new topic, or we might perhaps take our mid-morning break.
No, that's absolutely fine. I shall return at 11:45.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you, my lady. Professor Summers, can I turn to you, please, and just look briefly at ICU capacity in 2021? Because we've concentrated a lot on the early stages of the pandemic, and I think you make the point in your report that, in fact, by early 2021, there was a far larger surge in critically ill patients than there had been earlier on in the pandemic. If it helps you, I'm at page 60 in your report. And I wonder if we could call up on screen figure 11 at 474-255_60. And with your help, Professor, I'd like you just to explain, we'll not go through all the regions, but all 4 nations are represented on this figure, which is the regional increases in occupied ICU beds above baseline provided by the Intensive Care Society,
And it's really to get a sense of how different it was in 2021 than how it was in 2020, or in some cases, it's the data from 2019. Perhaps if we take Scotland as the first example, can you speak to this? And is this showing us that in 2019 in Scotland, they had 203 occupied beds in ICU, and by 2021, that jumped considerably to 303.
Exactly. So this is a attempt to quantify the degree of the surge in ICU capacity that was required in January 2021 by using exact data at this time from NHS England and best estimates that they could acquire, I think, from Scotland and Northern Ireland. Subsequently, actually, it looks like their best estimates for Scotland were almost exactly correct when the real data has become a go equals and zigzag. And I think the important message from the entire UK picture is that the equivalent of about 141 extra intensive care units were required in January 2021 above the capacity that was available in January 2020.
Yeah.
And that's assuming a kind of average size of 15 or 16 beds in intensive care.
I think at the bottom of the screen it says it was based on one ICU being a 16-bed unit. And so by 2021, we needed 141 extra ICUs across the UK.
Yes, and we did not create that physical capacity of 141 extra ICUs with any more staff. To reiterate that point again, we did it with exactly the same number of staff as we had in January 2020 in terms of specialist critical care staff. We stretched what we had to make that extra capacity.
Understood. And I think, in fact, there is a accompanying document on page 61, which exemplifies this. And could we have the table at the top there? That ordinarily, in January 2020, this is just pre-pandemic, one member of staff cares for, it was a consultant, they cared for 12 patients, and you can see the jump there from into 2021, they were caring for 16 or as many as 33 patients. We're familiar with the changes to the nursing ratios, but when you look at some of the other people involved in providing care, pharmacists, there's a jump again, physiotherapists, speech and language, members of staff, occupational therapists, huge increases in the number of patients they had to care for in January 2021.
Intensive care is a multidisciplinary package of care for patients. All of these people and others besides, like the ICNOC data clerks that we heard about from Professor Rowan when she was speaking, administrative staff, support staff, are all required. And you can see some of these ratios are absolutely extraordinary.
And ordinarily, would these be all the people that would be around the bedside of the patient in ICU?
So they are all part of the intensive care multidisciplinary team.
And would they therefore be wearing a higher level of PPE because they were in an intensive care setting?
In most cases, yes.
Now, we've looked at the increases in intensive care, and I think when you gave evidence last week, we'd already made the point that the data was not necessarily entirely representative because there was a lot of people receiving critical care outside of an ICU and therefore weren't captured by the data. But can I ask you about any alterations to the kinds of people that came into ICU? And I'm at your paragraph 158. You make the point there that the data doesn't tell us entirely accurately the people that were receiving critical care outside of ICU. I think you say in your report there was also a fall in admissions. For example, those people that had suffered a heart attack and stroke, there was a significant drop in the number of those people attending ICU. And could we have on screen, please, figure 12A, which is a very neat depiction, there we are, of the fall in the number of admissions to intensive care. This is data that comes from ICNARC, my lady. But one can see that ordinarily, in 2016 to 2019, the grey range, there's fluctuations just above or below 300 people on average coming into intensive care with a heart attack per month. And then when we look at the yellow line, which indicates the pandemic, if one looks just after January 2020, a huge drop in the number of people being admitted. So what is that, under 150 or there or thereabouts. And it slowly rises, but still doesn't reach the same rough grey area that had been the case in the 3 years from 2016 to 2019. So people weren't presenting to ICU in the way that they had. Can you help me with this? I think you make the point in your report that there were fewer older people being admitted to ICU during the pandemic. And can you help with why that was?
So I guess to allude to the myocardial infarction graph that we show, I think there are data that very eloquently speak to the fact that not only were they not appearing in intensive care units with myocardial infarction, people were not appearing in hospital. And that actually, as a result of changes in behaviour and in people's trying to, I guess, do the best that they could, and people were probably dying at home rather than being admitted to hospital and having the care from hospital, and as a consequence of that, intensive care units that they might have done otherwise for their myocardial infarctions. And you can see that the decrease in admissions to ICU happened both in the peak of spring 2020, but also again in January, February 2021. Yep. So both of those coincide.
Whilst you're dealing with about to look at the older people, of course, my lady has the report from Professor Gale dealing with not only falls in ICU admissions, but falls generally into the healthcare system in relation to people with ischemic heart disease. So it's really tallying a number of different ways of showing that people weren't coming into the healthcare system for heart attacks and the like. All right, now onto older people admissions to ICU. What did you set out in your report, please, Professor?
There are several lines of evidence that suggest that at peaks of the ICU strain, that the people who were admitted to intensive care, despite there being no national change in policy, may actually not have been the same as those at times of less strain. And I think that Professor Rowan spoke to some of this, but to reiterate, one example of the data supporting that proposal comes from ICNOC that looked at admissions to ICU during the first wave, and they found that people who were admitted during that wave were younger and less severely ill when compared to those who were admitted pre and post periods. So that's my paragraph 161. Their paper suggests that the proportions of patients aged greater than 75 years or with any prior dependency was lower during the peak period in 2020.
And that's not what one would have expected ordinarily.
I wouldn't have expected to see any change.
Yeah. I think you say the older and sicker patients will not have disappeared during that time, but fewer will have been admitted to ICU.
There's a second line of evidence that comes from a different organisation that suggests that this may have been the case. So ISARIC, via their clinical characterisation group, tracked the clinical longitudinal paths of just over 142,000 people who were admitted from across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom with COVID to hospital between March and December 2020. So again, covering the sort of wave 1 period rather than wave 2. And they found that the likelihood of a patient being in ICU 3 or 7 days after admission varied by month, and such that actually you were more likely in periods between surges to get admitted to intensive care than you were at periods of surge. So actually the people who were getting admitted were more likely to be younger during the peaks, which accords with the ICNOC suggestion from there looking at the peak of 2020.
So can I see if I can summarise this accurately, and correct me if I've got it wrong. Older people less likely to go into ICU during pre and post-peak periods, and people generally more likely to get into ICU between the surges.
So older people less likely to be admitted, and people with higher degrees of dependency were less likely to be admitted during the surges.
Yeah, understood. Now, why that might be may be difficult to ascertain, but can I ask you this? Was there any policy or diktat that said don't admit older people or anything of that nature?
I'm aware of absolutely no circumstances in which a policy was issued about age as a cut-off in the United Kingdom. I should also point out that also the type of care of critically ill people that was happening and where that was happening, as you point out, not all critically ill people were in intensive care units, and the strain on the intensive care units will have affected. At sometimes you may have had your CPAP in an intensive care unit at times of great strain where everybody in intensive care was receiving invasive mechanical ventilation. You may have had that on a ward. So being inside the walls of an intensive care unit doesn't necessarily mean you did or did not receive critical care.
Understood. I think, though, Professor, you are aware of the research that was conducted by the inquiry and have seen the findings of those of the survey. And can we have up on screen INQ 499523, perhaps _17? And this is a slide depicting what happened during the first wave and of the people that were contributing to the survey, and there was nearly 1,700 healthcare professionals who were spoken to UK-wide. If one just looks at the critical care nurse and the critical care doctor, they were asked during the first wave whether they was, how they were able to escalate by role and the frequency of their inability to escalate. And the critical care nurses said that there was 20% of them had to make a decision about that on a daily basis. 19% for critical care doctors, and we can see the varying statistics there. But when one looks at the last two columns, at least weekly, 34% of those critical care nurses had an inability to escalate. Indeed, critical care doctors, 35%, at least weekly. And then if we look at the EVA, again, 49% of critical care nurses had an inability to escalate, and critical care doctors, 48%. So fairly grim statistics, if I may put it like that, as to the people that contributed to this survey, suggesting that there was various reasons why the nurses and the doctors felt there was an inability to escalate. And some of those reasons, I think, were given, if one looks at page 19, thank you. The survey asked about the reasons for difficulty escalating, and if we could highlight the two columns that deal with critical care nurse and critical care doctor, one can see that lack of available beds for high dependency care such as high flow oxygen or CPAP. Look at the figures there for critical care nurses and critical care doctors. That clearly was a reason they felt unable to escalate. Lack of care or staff, 62 and 61% respectively. Lack of available beds for invasive mechanical ventilation, 85 and 80%. Lack of available beds for acute wards, lack of equipment, and I don't need to ask you about the lack of access to ambulance, but clearly indicative, I put it no higher than that, of difficult decisions having to be made and a number of varying resource reasons why people may not have been escalated. And does that not necessarily accord entirely with your experience, but does it come as a surprise to you that there are quite significant numbers of critical care nurses and doctors answering this survey saying they couldn't escalate for the reasons that are set out on page 19?
No, I think, like Professor Whitty, who I think was shown similar evidence when he testified the other day, this accords with the totality of the evidence that's available. It's a snapshot done this year, I understand, of how people felt their experiences were in 2020, and I'm not in any way surprised.
No. If one just looks, please, at page 22, Professor, there's a quotation given there from a critical care doctor in Wales. And they, in giving their experience of escalating care, they say, we knew it wouldn't help because we had to come and see what kind of people died of this disease despite escalated care. So we decided not to admit critical care, whereas they had a different illness. Whereas had they had a different illness, they probably would have been more likely to benefit, so we would have escalated. We didn't have enough space to give people a go who had a very remote chance of getting better. If we'd had more capacity, we might have been in a position to try.
I suspect not an easy thing for that doctor to have said. But can I ask you, please, about page 33 of the survey? And this is entitled Acting in Conflict with Roles, but critical care nurses were particularly likely having to act in a way which conflicted with their values when at work during the pandemic, likely linked to the higher proportion feeling that they were insufficient staff. And if you look there, daily, critical care nurses were reporting they were acting in conflict with values by role. And indeed, the critical care doctors, if one looks down the page slightly, 26% of those were saying they had that on a daily basis. Can you help with how acting in conflict with your roles and your values affected the staff on the ground, Professor?
I can. I think we heard very powerfully the other day from Professor Fong, who organised and led the peer support programme of visits. I should declare that I also participated in leading and attending some of those visits, and some of the evidence that he shared is evidence that I was privileged but also unfortunate to have to hear from staff members from various regions of the United Kingdom. I am only too painfully aware of the conflict and the moral injury that occurred to particularly critical care nurses, but healthcare staff of all kinds during the pandemic. It was and continues to be an ongoing issue for many of us.
I think in your report you set out some studies that were done into staff well-being and indeed whether the stresses they were under in fact impaired their ability to do their job. And I'd like to ask you about that, please.
Yeah.
I think there was, if it helps you, 135 onwards in your report.
Yeah. So there was work undertaken, again, actually led by Professor Fong in an academic capacity, to undertake series of surveys at different points, looking at how staff were doing in terms of their well-being. And actually 56 hospitals in England participated with around about 6,000 respondents across the time points. And it happened before the winter 2020-21 peak and during and after the winter 2021 peak.
So just pausing there, I think as a result of at least one part of the surveys over different periods of time, in November to December 2020, more than 50% of staff met or exceeded the threshold criteria for at least one of the surveyed mental health disorders. And what were those disorders, please?
So post-traumatic distress symptoms and functional impairment predominantly, but also there were questions around problematic alcohol misuse and other markers of mental health and functional impairment.
Now that's in the run-up to the pressures we've seen in January 2021. Was there I think the survey went on to look at January to February 2021. And can you help? What did the survey find in relation to that particularly stressful period in ICU?
So I think it found that later on at peak, those symptoms were increased in prevalence, as you would expect. I mean, no one can be surprised by this. You have a healthcare system and healthcare staff that were under tremendous stress in wave 1 or in spring 2020. The pressure never fully came off during the whole of 2020, and then going into 2021's peak, there was both the demands of a greater number of critically ill patients alongside the demands of trying to resume elective surgical care. And many of the people who were trying to support ICU surge are the same people who are required to undertake the delivery of elective surgical care. Anaesthetists often unusually are in operating theatres. In 2021, we were using their operating theatres for ad hoc intensive care units, and they weren't doing their day job. Of course, they were distressed, as were nurses, healthcare support workers, administrators, and not just in intensive care. I think that's the other point to make here. Whilst this data is around intensive care, there are data about healthcare workers in hospitals, all of whom have similar patterns of impairment.
I don't know if you heard Professor Fong on the radio this morning.
I did not.
And he was asked, he was talking about something else initially, but then was asked about giving evidence here. And one of the things he said was that the kind of impact that you've just described on staff is continuing today. And so if anybody is trying to make sure the NHS works in a way that we'd all hope, that we have to remember the impact on staff is still having an effect.
I think I would say that I don't know a healthcare worker, and certainly not an intensive care clinician, who does not carry the scars of the last 5 years. And you may have to forgive me a moment. All of us have carried it forwards. You cannot see what we have seen, hear what we have heard, and do what we have had to do and be untouched by it. You cannot and be human, and we are very much human.
And Doctor, you are nodding.
Yes, absolutely agree with all of that.
Professor, it brings me on to something I wanted to ask you about, which was a phrase in your report, which is as follows: "We coped, but only just."
Yeah.
And can you just try, please, to help Her Ladyship and us understand why it is you phrase it in that way?
I think what is often forgotten is that the catastrophic failure of a healthcare system would not be a switch that was just thrown in an instant, where we went from everything being okay to everything not being okay the next second. It is in the dilution of 1,000,001 tiny little things. Particularly in intensive care, we are a specialty of attention to detail. Every single tiny little bit of attention to detail is what makes the difference and cumulatively provide better outcomes for patients. When we stretch those and we are unable to pay the attention to all of those details in the way that we would want to and that we know we are capable of, we are failing our patients, or at least that's how it feels to us. We are not providing the care that we would want to, and that we would want for our own families. And whether you describe that as coping or not is a very moot point. Coped as in the outcomes were as good as we could make it, and we didn't get to the point where we had to say that there was national triage, but we would never want to be where we were. You know, large numbers of intensive care units declared CRITCON 3. That wasn't okay.
Final couple of discrete topics, I mean. If I may turn to you, Doctor, I just would like your help, please, about PPE in intensive care units. And we're familiar with the problems with lack of PPE that suits a diverse range of faces, size, ethnicities, and the like. But I'd like to ask you, please, about your paragraph 199, where you say, in general, there were adequate numerical quantities of PPE in ICUs, as these were often prioritised over other parts of the health and social care system. But I want to understand, were there any shortages of PPE within individual ICUs that you're aware of?
I think there's, and I use the word numerically there because there certainly were factors that were the opposite of reassuring. So different models arriving every day. Although hospitals carried out fit testing, the supplies changed. I'm not aware of specific shortages as a systematic factor. And the comment about ICUs compared to others is partly based on some research work that others have done of surveying people. So there was some advantage. However, it certainly felt at any given moment that things might be short, that things were changing all the time, particularly early in the pandemic. And obviously people have anxieties about their own health and about taking disease home to families. So it felt under pressure, it felt dangerous, it felt like shortages. Numerically, intensive care was arguably better than some other areas. Also due to decisions that FFP3 was used universally, and that wasn't the case elsewhere in the hospital, and arguably should be.
I won't take up that thread with you, if I may, Doctor, but can I ask you about this? You say in your report that there was clearly, obviously, the physical and emotional challenges of working with the significant more quantities of PPE being worn. And you make reference to uncertainty and changing guidelines, anxiety over supplies and fit testing, generally contributing to the psychological impact of the pandemic. Can I just ask you, which guidelines were you referring to in that part of your report?
There were initially guidance coming from the various bodies at the time which did actually change identity during the pandemic. So I think Public Health England moving into the other organisations. So there was reorganisation going on as well. And it was really around the best way of coping and diminishing risk early on. So appropriately, things were kept under review and disseminated as they changed. But at the front line, I think that it felt difficult to keep abreast of all of it.
Right.
And on the background of people's sort of concerns that they were getting what they needed.
Even within the ICU setting, where, as you say, you had FFP3.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for example, recommendations about, and to be fair to the organisation in the UK, obviously also affected by perceptions from elsewhere. So if you're seeing healthcare workers in other countries wearing full-body hazmat suits, then it sort of raised questions about what should be the right course of action here.
Understood. Right. I'd like to ask you about aerosol-generating procedures. We've heard quite a bit of evidence about that already, including that some of them may not in fact generate as many aerosols as hitherto believed, and also evidence that, AGPs aside, talking, coughing, singing, shouting inevitably generates aerosols. And I just would like your views, please, on the AGP list. I think you set them out at your paragraph 210. Help us with that, please.
So this was something where there was, again, debate about, including in elements such as resuscitation, which you may hear about from another witness. Also, some professions and specialties, as we've heard from Professor Summers, it's a very multidisciplinary profession, and particularly speech and language therapists felt that some of the interventions they do weren't adequately recognised. However, I think there's a wider issue, which is really the P in AGP. I'm not really qualified to talk about the aerosol and droplet side of it, but I think the focus on procedures rather than risk is a problem, because it means when there's no procedure going on, but you're in front of an infected patient, that risk is sort of diminished in the guidance, whereas actually taking the risk into account rather than what particular procedure they're having at the time is a better way of doing it. And particularly in intensive care setting where there's a procedure going on all the time somewhere and the patients are all together, again, a process on for procedures isn't necessarily the right thing. So guidance based on environment and risk profile would make more intuitive sense and be easier to handle. And as you say, there are many things that are not interventions that put you at risk if a patient coughs, for example.
Yeah, all right. Finally, please, this. I'd like to ask you in a minute about recommendations, but can I just draw together some of the things that you've been telling us during the course of your evidence? Clearly a significant impact on those working in ICU. Was any support in place to help the critical care nurse, those that were redeployed? Was there any support in place during any of the waves of the pandemic? Perhaps, Professor, I turn to you first.
So definitely healthcare system providers in a variety of ways attempted to provide support by making sure that counselling or other mental health services were made available. I think what's also important to remember is that providing support is fine. However, you're not also able to remove the source of the ongoing injury. If you have another wave coming and more patients coming in and you're trying to restore elective surgical services because there are a backlog of people who are also experiencing harm from not having their surgery, people cannot and do not want to stop working and continuing being exposed to the ongoing moral injury of not being able to provide care as they would want to. So it's a complex situation, and just providing a mental health service doesn't necessarily remove the strain.
shutting the door after the horse has bolted, maybe a very inelegant way of putting it, but you've got to tackle the underlying problem, and that's what I really wanted to ask you about. You've set out in your report a number of lessons learned and recommendations, and I wanted to ask, we've heard a lot about the stretching of ratios within the critical care setting. Do you know if there is any research ongoing to understand the minimum safe staffing requirements that we could stretch to if we needed to in the event of a future pandemic?
So actually, since before the pandemic, there has been a piece of research going on called Seismic that's been looking to generate an evidence base around staffing ratios, particularly nurse staffing ratios in intensive care units. I don't think at the time the work was conceived, it was thought about in terms of pandemic and stretch, but I understand that the authors and the people who are working on that are also including that strain in their work. But the results of that work are not yet available. But it's important work that I think will provide an evidence for how we provide care and ratios.
And I think just less academically, but from practical experience, I think something learnt during the pandemic was that, just to put a figure on it, very unscientifically, but the 1-to-6 ratios originally proposed caused excessive strain, even in this context. So moving to a 1-to-4 during the course of the pandemic before wave 2, which in a practical sense meant earlier decompression of the hot sites rather than letting them get to 1-to-6 and then seeing what happened next, I think was a crucial step. So whatever the number is, it's more likely to be 4 than 6 in a surge pattern.
And there is a reason we have one-to-one nursing care and intensive care outside of pandemic
Absolutely,
times.
Yeah, all right. I won't ask you about all of the other recommendations you set out, save for, I think, one of them, Doctor. I think you wanted to speak to the recommendation where you say to address the issue of future public health emergency, you recommend a citizens' assembly or other formal government consultation with an appropriate range of stakeholders. Why do you advocate for a citizens' assembly? What is it that you envisage they might do and assist with?
Thank you. It was largely just because I was a little bit vague to your question before, so in terms of a practical aspect of how this could be sort of addressed. But really the wider topic is of making sure that everyone who has an interest is involved, that we can work on developing moral and ethical principles for an agreed, fair and just framework for allocating healthcare if demand exceeds supply, so in a crisis. But also it's an opportunity to have a sort of honest conversation about the role of, if you like, extreme healthcare, aggressive healthcare towards the end of someone's life, both on a societal basis about how we might do things differently during a crisis and when things are overwhelmed, but also for people to have discussions with their families about what they themselves would want under normal conditions, but also in a future crisis, and to take that time while we're able to have those conversations in an open way and doing it in a structured format through the Citizens' Assembly. So thank you for that. And is it okay if we can pick out two of the others?
Well, I do. I was going to ask you each, actually, for it's not about single recommendations, but if there were one you wanted to impress upon her ladyship, what would it be? Perhaps you, Professor, first, or I don't mind who goes first.
I'm happy to go first. I think the thing that I would like to emphasise is that intensive care is, as we've entitled the report, the last line of defence. We are required when everything else has failed, when prevention hasn't worked, when improving and tackling health inequalities, all of those other things have not prevented disaster arriving at our door. And intensive care is a supportive care package. It did not change the trajectory of the pandemic. What changed the trajectory of the pandemic is therapies and vaccines and our research being embedded into the care system. If we do not ensure that that is a continued line of defence, it doesn't matter how much resource we put into healthcare systems. In the absence of being able to change the trajectory of any kind of emergency, we will potentially exhaust all capacity. So we have to embed into our response to emergencies, pandemic and otherwise, means to change the trajectory of them. And that means having robust supply lines, having the ability to understand novel emerging threats, to develop vaccinations and treatments, and to do that rapidly and at scale.
Ideally, we wouldn't need you.
Exactly.
Yeah, all right. And Doctor?
Thank you. Firstly, I'd very much agree with that. It has to provide life support while the disease gets better, so we need to address that. I'd completely agree with my colleague. The point I'd like to raise, though, is about the capacity side of it. We've talked about it many times, but we would propose as an objective measure in the next 2 years a systematic UK-wide review of baseline ICU capacity. And then the justification for that in this pandemic discussion is if we start lower, then we have to stretch more, and that does more damage. So it's about getting it right, not only in absolute sort of quantum, but also where it is, matching it to local populations, healthcare needs, planning ahead for changing patterns and disease and other processes. And we propose that be done by an independent body. Not by, for example, NHS England or the other NHS bodies, not because they can't be trusted, but because it puts them in a difficult position. They are the providers and have to look at the funding. And this is about identifying the need in an independent way. So a body such as an Nuffield Foundation or the King's Fund or a university to look at it independently with expert input from the critical care bodies, but also all of those involved in acute care, as well as epidemiology experts. So really a baseline look from the ground up at what critical care in the UK should look like. And then what can be afforded and provided becomes a separate discussion. And I think this is a piece of work that hasn't been done, but the pandemic should be a trigger for doing it.
Thank you very much. My lady, they are all the questions that I had.
Maybe you can't answer this, Professor Doctor. I've been asked to ask you about the making of DNA CPRs in the wider hospital setting. Is that a question for you or perhaps for a later expert?
I do not clinically practice outside an intensive care unit, so...
Doctor?
I would say the same. Sorry, the question was about a wider...
Yes,
wider
it's about people who are clinically vulnerable receiving calls at home about having notices put on them, on their records.
Oh, right, yeah. Again, I think that's
So beyond
far
your
outside our remit,
expertise.
yeah.
Thank you. Right, and the next person to ask questions is Mr. Jacob. Please don't worry about turning your back to me, but as long as your reply goes into the microphone. Thank you.
Just one question, actually, on behalf of the Trades Union Congress, and it actually takes up, Doctor, what you were describing a moment ago in terms of the recommendation for a UK-wide review of baseline capacity and an objective assessment of whether it is adequate and matched to local health needs. The need for a review is noted, but do you both have a view as to what baseline capacity should reasonably be so as to have a reasonable level of resilience in a pandemic?
I guess I might pick that up, reminding everybody that there are OECD figures for the number of intensive care beds per 100,000 population is one way of looking at the problem, but that doesn't take into account individual health inequalities and health need and burden of particular areas of geography. So the situation in how healthcare systems are delivered in one country compared to another and the health inequalities in those don't make that a straightforward calculation. So I would hesitate to give a precise number. It's more than we have because I think we demonstrated we do not have the capacity that we should do for routine care, let alone in pandemics. But I think it needs to be a properly conducted piece of work, and no one has done it.
Yeah. And I think just to add to the previous point about where it is as much as how much it is. And as somebody who works in London, I might be arguing against myself, but it's is everything in the right places and properly distributed around the regions and nations.
Thank you.
Are you able to give us a sense of how much the dial needs to shift in broad terms?
I think as to compare just among the OECD figures, so I think we entered the pandemic with about half a number of the median figure. So we're clearly some way behind, and the level of stretch seemed to be a lot higher for us.
So to give some further context to that, the OECD average in 2021 was 16.9 per 100,000 population, and we went in the UK considerably lower than that. Italy has 11.6 at that point, Sweden had 4.9, and Germany had 29.3. So there is wide variation, which I think feeds into how healthcare systems are delivered and individual nations, but we were definitely substantially below the average of the OECD nations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Who's next? Mr. Odogwu.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon. I represent the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations, which advocates for healthcare workers from ethnic minority backgrounds who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. My question is probably best addressed to Professor Summers, but I'm happy for Dr. Sangarillion to answer if better placed. The report acknowledges at paragraph 32 that staff ratios were diluted and that non-critical care staff were redeployed to assist ICU during the pandemic, which came at a significant cost to both the staff and patients. My question relates to potential racial disparities in the redeployment of healthcare workers during the pandemic. There has been some evidence in this inquiry of ethnic minority workers reporting that they were given higher risk tasks and being redeployed to COVID wards more often than their white colleagues. Did you, as part of your assessment and report, assess whether ethnic minority healthcare workers were overrepresented and more likely to be placed within ICU or critical care settings?
So I recognise very much the evidence that you reference has been heard by the inquiry. I could not find systematic data that outlined that problem for any of the nations. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. What it means is that there was no publicly available data that I could find. I'm not denying that that was the case, just that I could not find a data source to be able to reference.
The data gap in that sense. Okay. Given the well-documented higher rates of infection and mortality among ethnic minority healthcare workers, were you able to assess whether there were any adequate risk assessments or safeguards or policies that were put in place in ICU for ethnic minority healthcare workers?
So the occupational risk assessments that were done within the NHS were the same for intensive care staff as they were for all other NHS staff. So there wasn't a separate intensive care risk assessment undertaken.
So there was nothing tailored specifically to ethnic minority healthcare workers?
Or to intensive care workers is what I'm saying. It was the standard NHS occupational risk assessment rather than it being tailored to one particular group.
Yeah. Given the vulnerabilities of ethnic minority healthcare workers in particular, do you consider that there were adequate measures within the ICU setting for those workers?
I think as Dr. Sirlingham has emphasised, the availability of PPE and protective measures in intensive care settings was arguably better available than in other parts of the hospital. So I think that that's a complex question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, I think it's Ms Mitchell, who's directly ahead of you.
I appear as instructed by our Anwar company on behalf of the Scottish COVID.
I'm terribly sorry, I can't
That's it, you're
hear
on now,
you.
I think.
The microphone appears on.
Yeah, you're on now.
I'm on now. Okay. I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved, and I've got some questions to ask you about DNA CPR. Firstly, it's in relation to the confusion surrounding some of these notices. I don't need to take you to it, but at paragraphs 40 of your report, you state that DNA CPR notice is not meant as a proxy for broader treatment decisions. However, in the absence of a clearly documented discussion and decisions about other forms of treatment, there is a potential for inappropriate overinterpretation of DNA CPRs as a generalised treatment limitation option. Now, I presume that potential for overinterpretation is in respect of medical professionals, not of families and patients. Is that correct?
Potentially, although arguably it could be both. If that's the only discussion around treatment limitation that happens, then people may go away thinking that's been the wider discussion. But as I say, it can also lead to misinterpretation in the healthcare community. So to go back to treatment escalation planning, such as the Respect Form, which is being implemented in parts of Scotland, part of the argument for having that broader discussion is to be very clear about which is a CPR decision and which is around other treatments, and having the opportunity for people to say, I would like for myself or for my loved one active treatment, but I hear that CPR may not be the right thing for them. We can draw a line there, but other treatments should be actively pursued, which is actually a very standard sort of set of circumstances, and it avoids the risk of the DNA CPR itself being over-interpreted to cover other aspects of healthcare.
And indeed, one might make sense of that in terms of the recommendations that you've made in that regard. What I would like to ask on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved about those potential over-interpretations, or as you describe later, potential misrepresentation, is what were the possible implications for patients of those things that you describe?
And this is theoretical, but if it led to somebody thinking that somebody has a DNA CPR order and is therefore not for active treatment and of any sort, that would be incorrect. And to take a sort of fictional example, if it resulted in them not getting antibiotics for sepsis because they're somehow felt to be not for further active treatment of any sort, then that would obviously be quite a serious misunderstanding of what the DNA CPR meant. So this is a fictional example.
Can I ask you, moving on from that, you spoke about the questions, and in fact, Milady posed a question to you this about how the bereaved found out that there were DNA CPRs, sometimes from their loved ones who were still with us, or sometimes sadly no longer with us. Families were excluded for very good reason, obviously on occasion, from being with their loved ones when they were in hospital. Was the exclusion of loved ones from visiting a possible way that inadvertently DNA CPR discussions were lost for families at that time?
I think, so to start with the part of the hospital we're most familiar with and are really qualified to comment on, which is in intensive care, the sort of processes that Professor Summers described would have been how it was done. So if the families weren't there, which clearly was the case most of the time, they would have had the discussion or the explanation by telephone. Elsewhere in the hospital, we can't sort of necessarily comment, but if your question is, does the necessary visiting restriction raise the risk of things happening without those phone calls being made, then again, theoretically, I would say that it would be a risk.
Can I ask you then briefly about the issue of reviewing of DNA CPRs? Is the situation, as you understand it, in respect of the review of making a DNA CPR different in Scotland?
I don't, as far as I'm aware, no, in that the principles are the same. The legal position, I think, is roughly similar in that, although the legal position of advanced decisions to refuse treatment and so on is different, a DNA CPR is an advisory notice, and the principles that it should be discussed with the patient where possible, that people should be informed, that it guides treatment options, I think are the same across the nations.
And particularly in respect of the issue of review of DNA CPRs, is there a difference in Scotland as you understand it?
Not as I understand it. As far as I know, no nation has a sort of scheduled review process or anything formalised, but the principles are the same, which is if there are elements of the patient's condition that are acute, and those may change, and therefore if the patient's condition changes, for example, they improve, then any DNA CPR that's in place partly for that reason, due to severity, should be reviewed on clinical grounds rather than on any particular calendar or timescale. If the DNA CPR reflects fixed factors, such as their stable condition or where they are in their life in terms of getting towards the end of their life in terms of a natural death, then that may not be necessary for review on any particular timetable. If there is any sort of formal system for that that's different between the countries, I'm not aware of it, I'm afraid.
I wonder if there is, or there may be such a review. It doesn't seem entirely clear, I would have to say, but there is certainly a suggestion in the guidance guidelines in Scotland that there may be an opportunity for timed reviews. If this is something that the Chair may be interested in, might you be able to look into that and give us your expert response on that?
I guess I would point out, I think as Dr. Sirlingham has just said, there are circumstances in which a timed review would be appropriate if the status was likely to change, but I can think of other circumstances in which a patient would have had an informed discussion with their healthcare team, for example, in the setting of widely disseminated malignancy, and they were towards the end of their life, that it may not be appropriate to have a recurrent discussion with that patient because that status is unlikely to change. So I think it should be reviewed where clinically appropriate and where patients feel that they wish it to be reviewed too. Setting a hard and fast time point of reviewing it every so many days might not necessarily facilitate the kind of patient discussions that we would all hope for.
Yeah, I'd agree. And it may also have unpredicted effects. If there's a timed review every week, for the sake of argument, the patient improves within 2 days, it may actually sort of delay a discussion that might otherwise have happened. I mean, it shouldn't do, but there are ups and downs of all these things in healthcare.
I'm obliged, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Mitchell. Very grateful. Ms Woodward. Right. I think you may have to look round the pillar.
Okay. Thank you.
I ask questions on behalf of COVID bereaved families for Justice Cymru, and we've heard evidence today about the drafting of a national prioritization framework, and notwithstanding the fact that this was never formally implemented, at paragraph 156 of your report, you state that unfortunately it is likely that in practice ICU capacity was overwhelmed in some individual locations at certain times, and that the criteria for ICU admission changed via local informal processes when capacity was stretched. And you set out that this was conscious or unconscious alterations in decision-making by individual clinicians rather than due to policies or guidelines being issued. And that meant that those who might usually be admitted to ICU were not. And we've also discussed in your evidence today that critical care was often being delivered outside of the ICU setting, and that means, as you also set out in your report, that the data likely underestimates the overall number of critically ill patients. My question arising from that is it likely that the informal variations in ICU admissions, combined with the data underestimating the overall number of critically ill patients, created an incorrect perception that critical care was not saturated?
I think that is one interpretation of the situation. I guess what I would like to be able to give you a definitive answer is absolute concrete data to say that that was the case. I have, in writing this particular section, and it was me who drafted this particular section, set out the data that I could find to support that there may have been a change in the people who were admitted to intensive care units, whilst acknowledging, as you rightly highlight, that not everybody who was critically ill was admitted to an intensive care unit, and often critically ill patient treatment was carried out in places that would not normally do so. So I think we have an incomplete picture. But I certainly cannot tell you that it was not saturated. And I guess the other thing that I would highlight is that, and I've quoted it, I think Helen McNamara, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, suggests that she had a conversation or was present for a conversation where it was suggested that ventilator capacity may have been exceeded in January 2021. That was not something I was aware of until reading her evidence to Module 2, and is concerning.
Just on the leaving aside data, but sort of anecdotally, as it were, I noted that that IFF survey, there was actually a doctor from Wales, as it happened, who stated that they were perhaps not admitting people at lower threshold as it might have done because it was perceived that the disease process for COVID was different. And that's really an example of where there's arguably a need for guidance so that individual clinicians are not put in that position, and either they know to wait until there's a state of triage or that they have some guidance whether professionally or nationally, to encourage that decision making. So I'd make the wider point that it's the role of national bodies to step into that breach and support not only their members but the wider patients and public in order to prevent variation and provide consistency among the four nations, but also to make sure the staff don't have that moral injury of feeling themselves in that position without external support from the people that are meant to be representing and protecting them.
And do you think that perhaps that incorrect perception may have led those in charge to believe that a formal prioritisation framework was not needed when in fact perhaps either a framework or more formal guidance was in fact needed from those in charge?
So I do not think and we looked at the data when we were here a week ago, the proportion of intensive care units that declared CRITCON 4, and I think NHS England have shared their data on that, was incredibly small. So I think actually the units, when asked to assess their strain, almost all, whilst under huge strain, did not declare that they had reached the point where they thought that that was an appropriate thing and that we needed to proceed to national triage.
And I would, for reassurance, I would echo that among the three nations, including Wales, because although they weren't specifically using CRITCON as a tool due to the different sizes and sort of layers of complexity, but I think that information about local strain was being passed up and down the chain in a similar way. So I think had hospitals reached that state, it would have been transmitted in a way that then triggered the activation of further measures, and that wasn't the case.
But given what you've said in your report about local informal processes likely changing, is it likely that prioritisation decisions were made and were in fact occurring, but just in the absence of formal guidance as to how those decisions should be approached?
So to be really clear, there's a very big difference between prioritising whether critical care is appropriate for an individual patient, and we know from data before the pandemic that people sometimes when their intensive care is strained, vary in a soft, ill-defined way, the way in which they make those decisions. And I think the data from Wales, the doctor said in the survey about patients who they think might not have benefit from critical care, but there's a small chance they might on some days would get admitted, but at times of strain would not. That is a very different thing from triage by absence of resource.
Do you think that there was any scope for further guidance to perhaps bridge that gap where critical care was reaching saturation, but we weren't quite at CRITCON 4? Or the equivalent for the devolved nations?
So I think there was very clear guidance that usual decision-making should proceed and that decisions should be made in the best interest of individual patients, absolutely, until the points that it was declared people were at CRITCON 4 and there was national guidance for anything to change. I think that was repeatedly and appropriately shared by all nations at multiple time points during the pandemic.
And I think sort of greater awareness of the guidance that did exist and that there was something in the background that could be activated and engagement by all the relevant parties, which in this case was endorsed by the Welsh Intensive Care Society and Critical Care Network Wales. But I think broader awareness of that is probably the answer to your question, that there is a plan and it could be brought out. But in the meantime, usual decision-making applies, as Professor Summers has said.
Thank you. Given the evidence that we heard earlier from you, Professor Summers, about older people being less likely to be admitted into ICU during the surges, despite no policy that you were aware of regarding this, is it likely that the elderly were disproportionately disadvantaged by unconscious or conscious alterations in decision-making made on an informal basis?
So I think to clarify exactly what I said, both verbally and in the report, I said elderly people and those with greater burdens of comorbidities. So it was not just purely an age phenomenon. Excluding anybody from anything on a purely age basis, I'm surrounded by lawyers, so I'm aware of this, is legally dubious, is I think where I will go. But actually, it's ethically inappropriate too. What matters is the individual patient and their circumstance and their comorbidities and their health status and their values and wishes. So I am not aware of anywhere where there was an expressed policy, formal or informal, where age was used as a cut-off.
My next question is about continuous positive airway pressure, or CPAP, I think as it's more commonly referred to. And if we could please bring up INQ 480136. Thank you. This is a witness statement prepared on behalf of the Cardiff and Vale University Health Board. And if we could look at the bullet point right at the bottom of the page, this is setting out the various steps that were taken at the local level by the Health Board to increase ICU capacity. And it says, patients who under normal circumstances would have gone to critical care for CPAP or non-invasive ventilation or high-flow nasal oxygen were admitted to the escalated respiratory support unit on the respiratory ward instead. And at the top of the next page, on the third line down, it says, it was agreed that should a patient not improve after 3 days on the ward level, that with CPAP or high-level nasal oxygen, then they would refer for possible transfer to ICU. And at the very bottom of that paragraph, it states that the published data from across all of Wales showed that there was no significant difference in mortality for patients receiving CPAP managed on the respiratory wards and or on ICU when corrected for age and comorbidity. But there was a notable difference between Wales and England in this regard, as many more patients in England had CPAP on ICU. And I wanted to ask you, on the basis of this, what the drawbacks and risks are to patient safety of not receiving CPAP on the ICU and instead receiving it on a ward.
So ordinarily acutely unwell and hypoxemic, so lacking in oxygen, patients would receive CPAP inside a critical care setting. We do that because it provides an increased level of ability to monitor the patient, both their oxygen levels, experienced care, providers, and also a higher nursing ratio and physiotherapy ratio than you might perhaps have on a regular ward. So that would be our default gold standard way of delivering care. Unfortunately, that was not possible during the pandemic at scale, and not just in Wales. There is data suggesting that in many hospitals, up to 50% of people received their CPAP outside an intensive care unit. It's the critically ill people who are not inside critical care units that I have repeatedly referred to.
But is it fair to say...
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Monroe.
Good afternoon. My name is Alison Monroe. I represent COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. I have a few questions. Some of them have been touched upon to lesser or larger extent during the course of your evidence. My lady, I'll try and rationalise and summarise my questions accordingly. First one is in relation to escalation to ICU. Dr. Sundtharalingam, I look towards you, but of course, Professor Summers, feel free to jump in and vice versa. Same paragraph that you've just been referred to, actually, okay. Paragraph 156 at your page 61, but a different question arising. That's the paragraph where you note that in practice, ICU capacity was overwhelmed in some locations at certain times, which chimes in with the evidence from Professor Fong of last week. And you go on to say the criteria for ICU admissions change via local informal processes, in brackets conscious or unconscious, alterations in decision-making by individual clinicians rather than due to policy or guidelines being issued. And then you add, this is a contentious topic for which robust data is challenging to assemble. Doctor, in terms of what we can glean and what we take from those observations, does that mean that although national guidance and policies had not officially changed or altered, there were instances of some local hospitals and ICUs operating a system of perhaps what I can, if I can call it, resource-led clinical prioritisation? I don't know if this chimes in with this triage in the absence of resource.
I will defer to Professor Simon. In a sense, that was a sort of bridging paragraph looking at what the guidelines and the policy was and then leading into what may be more data-led. So I'll pass on to my colleague.
Thank you. So in drafting this paragraph, what I was trying perhaps ineloquently to communicate is that whilst no policy was ever, and guidance that decision making should change was ever issued, I wasn't certain that that hadn't happened, hence my use of conscious and unconscious, because I cannot speculate about the individual decision making that happens in every case by every clinician across all 4 nations of the country. And I was trying to communicate uncertainty as opposed to me having evidence that particular things happened.
And so on that specific point of resource-led clinical prioritisation, do we simply not have the data, robust data, to come to any conclusions?
Other than the data that I presented about the changes during the peak of the demographic characteristics of the people who were admitted, I couldn't find any data, and I did look quite hard. But that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean it did happen. It just means I could not find data.
Thank you. Staying on the issue of data, ICNARC data, you again touched upon this in your evidence just before or just after the break. And I want to highlight 2 parts of your report. And I think, again, you mentioned paragraph 161 on page 64. But the next paragraph, 162, you note that the ICNARC publication data raised the possibility, and you put it no higher than a possibility, that, quote, effects were directed at saving patients with the greatest chance of survival, those who were younger and previously fitter, but with the most severe illness during the peak of the first wave. And then you talk about, again, same page, paragraph 164, this group, the 142,000 longitudinal clinical path, where they found, quote, ward mortality was highest when older patients were least likely to be admitted into ICU, suggesting these patients may potentially have benefited from ICU admissions. So just a couple of questions arising from that, please. Firstly, is it fair to conclude then that the corollary of that data and those observations was that patients who became very ill with COVID-19 in this period, who required intensive care but were not admitted to ICU, for example, due to old age or pre-existing health conditions and disabilities, effectively had their chances of survival reduced?
So I think what I was trying to say was that at times of strain, the data and the authors of both these separate publications said that in people who were thought to be less likely to survive, so people who were older and had a greater burden of healthcare comorbidity, they were less likely to be admitted to an intensive care unit, and that their mortality was thereby increased. Now, whether that mortality is increased as a function of the fact that they were thought initially to not be as likely to survive as a younger, less comorbid person, I am unable to tell. I can tell you that their mortality was increased, and they were less likely to come to an intensive care unit. Whether those 2 things are causally related, I can't tell you from the available data.
All right. Secondly, at paragraph 163, you further consider the analysis of the data. And you use a phrase, it's by the authors of the report, not yours, rationing of care. And my question is this, Professor, do you accept or believe that the informal, quote, rationing of care, due to a lack of ICU capacity, likely caused or contributed to deaths during this period?
I think what I would say is that I have uncertainty. I don't think that I can tell you either way. I don't have anything to support it. I cannot rule it out and I cannot rule it in.
All right.
If you ask me for an overall impression, I think it would be a very unwise person who tells you that in every circumstance, in every hospital across the country, that something happened as it was supposed to happen.
Thank you very much. And then thirdly, on this related topic, and this may be a question for you, Doctor, you spoke earlier about transparency and the need for transparency when you were discussing the clinical tool for the 4 nations to consider clinical prioritisation levels. Now, this question is maybe a difficult one because it sort of traverses perhaps moral, ethical, and perhaps even political considerations. But do you consider that patients and their families could or should have been told that there were instances, if there were instances, where decisions not to admit them to ICU were based on resources rather than whether or not admission was clinically indicated? Is that something they should have been told or indeed could have been told?
I think it sort of, and the question takes the premise that it happened, which we don't know. And and in fact, just in reference to your last question, I noticed that the quote you came from London, and actually there's a lot of transfer activity, and hospitals that became overwhelmed would be transferring out. And London, the hospitals are close. I happen to work there. The hospitals are fairly close together. The transfer systems were there prior to COVID to a large extent. So I think it's less likely, if anything, that somebody would simply turn someone away for lack of beds when there's another hospital not far away. But that's just a comment on that particular paragraph, as it were. I think to answer the present question, as a matter of principle, I would say, yes, they should be told. It's difficult to answer whether they were told because I'm not aware of those particular scenarios happening. I think if there were some future crisis, whether it's disease or anything else, some other major incident, and decisions were made on that basis using whatever framework or tool was in use at the time, then as a matter of principle, yes, people should be told that this is the reason. You know, we would admit you to ICU normally. We're unable to now for these and these factors. This is how we made the decision, and there should be transparency. As I say, I can't comment on whether that's happened this time. We don't believe it did. And so that's as far as I can answer that, I think.
Thank you. Frailty scoring and DNA CPR. We've dealt quite a lot with DNA CPR, so perhaps looking more at the frailty scoring aspect here. You refer to the NICE in your report at page 45 and 46, paragraph 108, the NICE algorithm of 22nd of March 2020, which was part of a broader written agreement that emphasised the limitations of using clinical frailty scales. Do you believe that as a result of the NICE algorithm and guidance, there was a risk that clinicians would perhaps overestimate clinical frailty scores and associated factors such as age, pre-existing health conditions, when considering whether patients were eligible for ICU admission, ventilation, and other hospital care, at a time when there was the severe constraints on resources and capacity?
So that guidance was separate to our piece of work. I think my understanding is it was brought out in a form which talked about the frailty score without sort of qualification and was then rapidly withdrawn and replaced with a version that made some points about not misinterpreting frailty in the context of, for example, stable disability. And just to sort of gloss that a little bit, the frailty score, which is a clinically validated tool used in the care of the elderly community as a marker of biological frailty, in other words, people's bodily tissues slowly deteriorating to the point where their ability to recover from illness is impaired. And there are proxy measures for that, which include their state of mobility and their general health. Now, inevitably, in putting things into that sort of framework, things get simplified. And, for example, the need for being bedbound or the need for carers and so on becomes part of the assessment. And one of the dangers of it is that somebody who, for example, might need carers for another reason, such as learning disability, but that doesn't reflect biological weakness, so to speak, in their bodily tissues, may become labelled with that. So a clarification was made by the authors of the NICE guidance, which was not ours, that firstly, this shouldn't be used under 65, where it's not validated. The tool was validated in those older, and that care should be taken to consider other factors. Now, in the terms of the guidance and your question, the later work that was done very clearly paired those discussions with capacity and escalation, mutual aid, and CRICCON and other measures of units being overwhelmed. So in any formal sense, people should not have been using the tool because they had not been authorised to do so because the nation was not in a state of CRICCON 4. And part of the argument for making it public and open and transparent is that people are aware that's the framework and the sort of guardrails to stop it being used prematurely. So I think that I would answer the question that way, which is that the discussion around frailty is complex. Including it in a decision-making tool in a situation of the healthcare system being overwhelmed is a topic for discussion, and the more discussion and development we have of it, the better. But there wasn't a situation where it would have been used in its current form, as we didn't reach that operational trigger. The NICE guidance I can't really comment on, but I do note that a version was withdrawn and replaced with one which made some explanatory notes to clarify the use of frailty scoring. The document which we then later worked on was a separate one which went into a little bit more detail. And I think that's all I can leave it there. In consultation with, as part of that piece of work, discussion with, I believe Age UK and other bodies, they commented on the fact that graphics were what they felt to be simplifying and potentially demeaning. So the graphical element of the frailty score was taken out in the version that we then used. But there's obviously a lot more to it than just that.
Thank you. And my final question has, for the most part, been answered. But if I can just ask you, perhaps, Professor Summer, to point of clarification more than anything else. In your paragraph 55 of the report, you talk about, obviously, the poor mental health of ICU staff and the phenomenon of presenteeism, working while sick, where staff continue to work even though their functioning is impaired. Now, I think from your answers, both to my lady and to Ms Carey, King's Counsel, that you would agree that the poor mental health of healthcare workers during the pandemic is likely, or could have been likely, to negatively impact upon the quality of care and safety of patients. Unquestionably. And you said in answers right at the end of your examination by Ms Carey, King's Counsel, that no one can be surprised by this. The pressure never came off in 2020, and then going into 2021, peaks, there were greater demands as well as trying to resume elective surgery care. We all carry the scars of the last 5 years. So my question is simply this, on behalf of those that I represent. Has enough, do you think, been done to help healthcare workers heal from those scars and prevent the moral distress leading to moral injury that Dr. Sun Tharalingam described last week, and the poor mental health impacting negatively upon patients?
I think that is a really difficult and complicated question that's not easy to answer. How much would be enough to offset what everybody has been through? I'm not sure that for people whose loved ones were in hospital, for those of us that were in hospital or in the primary care settings or in social care settings, there would ever be enough support to make what we all went through better. Is there enough support to enable people to continue to do their roles in a way that makes the healthcare system safe? I think that the commitment and the amazing efforts by healthcare workers and social care workers, I think that should be recognised to continue to deliver care for those that need it, has been extraordinary. Many of them are continuing to do so, carrying the scars that I talked about. They won't ever be the same. There is no going back to how we were before. That's not possible. You can't unsee things. But there is a huge, huge burden of care that is still needed. There are enormous elective waiting lists and care lists that need to be addressed because they were delayed during the pandemic, and we went into the pandemic with some fairly sizable waiting lists too. So there is no chance to pause and reflect and stop and repair. People are doing the very best they can.
Okay, I would completely agree with that, and I'd just like to raise one element without in any way taking away from any of that. So one positive bit of learning, I think, and improvement has been there's greater emphasis now across the healthcare sector about well-being, but also in concrete terms, more ICUs now have clinical psychologists funded and deployed, and they look after either the same people or different teams look after the staff as well as patients. This was part of standard critical care in other countries, such as France, and I think this has been an important positive development. I wouldn't want to in any way say that's enough or part of it, but there's just a group of staff, just to mention really the work that they do and the importance of having them resourced and funded. But that's only one small part, and I completely agree with Professor Summers' wider message.
And it's not just intensive care staff that carry these scars.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Anna.
We've gone over into lunch. I do apologise.
Don't worry, not your fault. That completes all the questions we have for you. Thank you both for all your clinical work, obviously, and I can only imagine the scars that you've talked about. Thank you for your help in preparing the written report and, of course, the help you've given in the course of your evidence. It has been extremely helpful. And thank you for your patience, having had your evidence disrupted last week. So thank you again.
Good to get. Thank you very much.
2:10.
Thank you, my lady.